The notice was nailed to the door of the boarding house at 3:30 in the afternoon, while Elena Whitmore was still upstairs trying to coax Lily into eating the last of their cornbread. She heard the hammering first, 3 hard strikes, the kind that meant business, not carpentry. Then Mrs. Aldous Finch's voice floated up through the floorboards, clipped and formal in the way she only got when she was performing for an audience. "Miss Whitmore, I'll need you downstairs. Immediately." Elena set down the bread. Lily looked up from the small cot where she'd been drawing circles on the frost-fogged windowpane with her fingertip. "Mama?" "Finish your supper," Elena said. She kept her voice even. She was good at that, had been good at it for years, had learned to sand the panic out of her voice the way you sand a rough board. "I'll be right back." She wasn't right back. The paper on the door said she had until sundown to vacate the premises. It said her rent money was no longer acceptable. It didn't explain why, but it didn't need to. The whole of Harlan Creek had been watching Elena Whitmore the way people watch a house fire, with that particular combination of horror and satisfaction that comes from seeing someone else's life collapse instead of your own. Mrs. Finch stood in the front hall with her arms folded, a woman of 50-some years and considerable local opinion, wearing an expression like a door that had been bolted from the inside. "I've got a week left on my rent," Elena said. She held the paper at her side, not crumpling it, though every muscle in her hand wanted to. "The arrangement has changed. You took my money 6 days ago. Circumstances," Mrs. Finch said primly, "have changed." "What circumstances?" The older woman's eyes cut to the parlor doorway, where 2 of the other boarders stood pretending not to listen. She lowered her voice, though the lowering of it felt more like a formality than real discretion. "There is talk about you, Miss Whitmore. Talk I am not in a position to ignore. I run a respectable establishment, and I cannot—" "What talk?" Elena's voice stayed flat. Not angry, just flat, the way iron gets flat when you've hammered all the heat out of it. "Talk." Mrs. Finch looked at her steadily. "I'm sure you know what talk." She did know. She'd been knowing it for 3 weeks, watching it spread from person to person the way a creek rises. Slowly at first, then all at once. Then suddenly you look down and the floor is wet, and there's nothing left to salvage. She just hadn't expected it to reach the boarding house quite so fast. "I have a child," Elena said. "I am aware." "It's December. There's snow coming. I am also aware of that." Mrs. Finch unfolded her arms long enough to smooth her apron, a gesture that managed to look both nervous and final. "I am sorry for your circumstances, but I cannot have my other guests uncomfortable." Elena looked at the paper in her hand for a moment. Then she folded it in quarters, tucked it into her coat pocket, and went back upstairs to pack. She had 2 bags. That was everything. 2 canvas bags that held the whole of their lives. Lily's extra dress, a pair of boots 2 sizes too large that Elena had bought for her to grow into, 3 books, a tin of sewing needles, a photograph she kept wrapped in a square of flannel at the bottom of the second bag. She didn't take it out. She knew what was in it, and she didn't need to look at it right now. Lily watched her from the cot. "Are we moving again?" Lily asked. "We're going to figure something out." "Are we going somewhere warm?" "Yes," Elena said. The lie came out smooth and automatic, the kind of lie that isn't really a lie so much as a postponed truth. She was going to find somewhere warm. She just didn't know where yet. "Can I bring my drawing things?" "Yes." "What about my rock collection?" Elena glanced at the windowsill where Lily had arranged 8 small stones she'd gathered from the road over the past 2 weeks. Quartz chips and a piece of polished creek granite, and a flat gray oval that Lily swore had a face on it if you held it right. She picked them up and wrapped them in a handkerchief and tucked them into the bag. "All right," she said. "Come on." Main Street in Harlan Creek ran 2 blocks long and carried the self-important air of a place that knew it was the only option for 40 miles in any direction. There was a dry goods store, a smithy, a post office that also sold patent medicines, 2 saloons, a small church, a barbershop, and a bank that had recently expanded into a building twice the size it needed because Calvin Mercer, who owned it, believed in the symbolic power of square footage. Elena walked down that street with Lily's hand in hers, and both bags slung over one shoulder, and she felt the town watching her. She was used to being looked at. She had dark hair and strong features and a directness in her eyes that some people found unsettling and others found attractive. And she'd learned early that attention, in most of its forms, was more trouble than it was worth. But this was different. This was the particular quality of gaze that a community reserves for someone it has collectively decided to disapprove of. Not one pair of eyes, but a dozen, all calibrated to the same temperature. The dry goods store owner, Hatch, stepped outside as she passed and watched her without waving. Two women outside the post office stopped talking and simply looked. A man Elena didn't know crossed the street ahead of her, not hurrying, just making sure he came out on the other side before she reached the same stretch of boardwalk. She went to the dry goods store first because she needed to try. "I need to ask about credit," she told Hatch, "just until I can get some work." Hatch was a large man with a thick mustache and a habit of standing slightly sideways to the person he was talking to, as though he might need to exit the conversation quickly. He looked at his hands. "Can't do that," he said. "I've paid on time every time I've come in here." "It's not about that." "What is it about?" He looked sideways, literally sideways at the window. "You should probably ask someone else." She asked someone else. The someone else had heard things. The someone else was sorry. The someone else had their own family to think about. By the time Elena had made the full length of Main Street, the sun had dropped behind the ridge line, and the cold had turned from uncomfortable to serious. The snow that had been threatening all afternoon finally made its decision and started falling, not the pretty, lazy kind, but the mean, fine kind that blew sideways and found every gap in a coat collar. Lily pressed close to her side. "Mama, I'm cold." "I know, baby." "Where are we going?" Elena looked up and down the street. The light was fading. The storefronts were closing up one by one, their lamp glow going warm and orange behind glass that she was no longer going to get to stand on the other side of. "I'm thinking," she said. She thought about the church, which she'd heard had a meeting room. She thought about the livery stable, which was warm in the way animal enclosures are warm, but which also belonged to a man named Tatum, who'd been pointedly unhelpful every time she'd dealt with him. She thought about sleeping under the covered porch of the general store, which was possible and which would be humiliating in a way she was still capable of being humiliated by. And she hated herself a little for caring about that because humiliation was survivable and frostbite was not. She was standing there in the middle of the street, trying to do the arithmetic of survival without any of the numbers working out, when she heard boots behind her and a voice that was not friendly but was not hostile either, just direct, the way a man talks when he's already decided something and is past the persuasion phase. "You're Elena Whitmore." She turned around. He was tall, taller than she'd registered on the occasion she'd seen him in town before, which had been few and brief. Silas Boon was not a man who spent much time in Harlan Creek, and when he did appear it was with the compressed, purposeful energy of someone who has a list of things to accomplish and intends to accomplish them and leave. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, though the outdoors had aged him in the particular way it ages men who live in it rather than near it. Dark coat, dark hat with snow accumulating on the brim, a jaw that looked like it had been shaped by extended disagreement with the world. "I am," she said. He looked at Lily, then back at Elena. He didn't say anything for a moment, which was a quality she would come to understand was characteristic. Silas Boon took up space without filling it with noise. "Where are you planning to go tonight?" "I'm working on that." "Working on it how?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he already suspects the answer and is waiting for her to say it out loud. "I'm not sure that's your concern," Elena said. He absorbed that without obvious reaction. "I've got a cabin on my property," he said. "Nobody in it. It's dry and the stove works. I'm not offering charity. I need someone to cook, keep the main house, help around the homestead. The work's real, and it's not easy. I can pay a wage once the season turns and I sell the spring cattle." Elena looked at him steadily. "Why are you doing this?" "I just told you why." "You told me you need help. I'm asking why you're offering it to me, right now, on this street." Something moved behind his eyes, though his face didn't change. "Because it's December," he said. "And because I watched 3 people tell you no in the last 20 minutes, and nobody else is going to offer you better tonight." That was honest, at least. Brutally so, but honest. She looked down at Lily, who was looking up at Silas with the frank, assessing stare that 7-year-olds apply to new people before they've learned that staring is rude. Silas looked back at her without apparent discomfort. "What's your name?" Lily asked. "Silas." "That's an old name." "I'm aware." "Mama has an old name too, Elena, but she says it's just old-fashioned, not old." "Your mama's right," Silas said. Lily seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked back at Elena. "Is he nice?" "I don't know yet," Elena said, which was the truth. She looked at Silas again. He waited. He was good at waiting. She could see that already, some quality of stillness that came not from patience exactly, but from the absence of the need to perform. "One thing," she said, clear from the start, I don't want any misunderstanding about what kind of arrangement this is." "There won't be," he said. "The cabin's yours. You work the homestead. That's the arrangement. And you'll leave it at that." "I'll leave it at that." She believed him. She didn't fully understand why, but she believed him. Maybe because men who wanted something other than what they claimed usually worked a little harder at seeming harmless, and Silas Boon wasn't working at anything. He was just standing there in the snow, telling her the truth as he saw it, and waiting for her to decide. "All right," she said. The road to the Boone Ranch climbed for 4 miles into the hills north of town, and by the time the wagon reached the turnoff, the snow had settled in for real, steady and windswept, the kind that fills ruts and softens edges and makes the whole world look like it's been wrapped in something quiet. Lily had fallen asleep against Elena's side within the first mile, and Elena sat with one arm around her daughter and watched the dark shapes of pines slide past in the lantern glow. She'd made bad decisions before. She knew what they felt like. The particular texture of a choice you know is wrong even as you're making it, the way it sits in your chest like something you swallowed wrong. This didn't feel like that. It felt like desperation, which was different. Desperation had a certain clarity to it, a reduction to what was necessary and what wasn't. What was necessary was warmth, food, a safe place for Lily to sleep. Everything else could wait. Silas drove without talking, which she appreciated. He handled the team with the economy of a man who's done it 10,000 times. No wasted movement, no nervous checking of the traces, just the steady forward pull of someone who knows where he's going. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked, mostly to hear what he'd say. 11 years. "Alone?" A pause. Not a hesitant one. More like he was deciding something. "For the last 4. She didn't ask what had changed 4 years ago. The answer was in the way he said it, in the 4 years that lived in those 3 words like a stone in a pocket. "The cabin's been empty 2 seasons, he said. "There'll be work to make it right. The stove draws, but the window on the west side needs a new piece of oilskin. I'll have it by the end of the week. I can manage without it for a few days. It'll be cold. I've been cold before." He glanced at her sideways, once, then returned his eyes to the road. "I imagine you have," he said. The ranch materialized out of the dark, and the snowfall in pieces. First the fence line, then the dark bulk of the barn, then the main house with a single lamp burning in the front window, left on, she would later learn, not for show but as a habit Silas couldn't quite break. The habit of a man who used to come home to a house where the light meant something. The cabin sat 30 yards from the main house, tucked against a stand of lodgepole pine that would break the worst of the north wind. It was small but solid. Logs fitted tight, a covered porch barely wide enough for a chair, and a pair of boots, a stone chimney. Inside, a single room, a stove, a table, a rope bed with a straw tick, a window with oilskin already brown and cracking at the corners. Elena set Lily down on the bed and started the stove before she did anything else. The wood was dry and the stove caught without coaxing. She stood over it with her hands out until she could feel her fingers again, then turned and looked at the room. It wasn't much. The table wobbled on one leg. The oilskin window let in a thread of frozen air. There was a smell of long disuse, of cold log and mouse, and something she couldn't identify but wasn't alarming. There was a rusted hook on the wall above the table where someone had once hung a lantern, but it was solid, it was dry. The stove was already putting out heat. Lily stirred on the bed, not quite waking. "Mama?" "Still here," Elena said. "Are we home?" It was such a simple question. "Are we home?" She'd learned not to answer questions like that with the words she knew Lily wanted, because she'd said yes before and been wrong, and wrong meant moving again. And moving again meant Lily's face doing the thing it did. Not crying, because Lily at 7 had already made some private determination about crying that Elena both understood and found heartbreaking. Just a slight stiffening. A going quiet that was worse than tears. "We're warm," Elena said. "That's what matters tonight." Lily considered this with the serious pragmatism of a child who has learned to find comfort in smaller things. "Okay," she said, and went back to sleep. The first week on the Boon Ranch was a negotiation with reality. Elena had worked hard before, had cooked and cleaned and mended and hauled since she was old enough to be given a task and told to do it properly. But there was working hard, and there was working hard at altitude in December on a ranch that had been half kept at best for 2 seasons, and these were different orders of difficulty. The main house was a larger version of the cabin's philosophy. Solid, functional, almost willfully unadorned. Silas had built it himself, she would learn, with 2 hired men and his own hands, in the 2nd year of his marriage to a woman named Nora. He didn't talk about Nora. He did not talk about Nora either. Her name simply appeared, occasionally attached to context. Nora had planted the herbs against the south wall of the house. Nora had wanted a proper shelf in the kitchen, and he'd never gotten around to building it. Nora had kept a crockery jug on the windowsill that was still there. Elena didn't touch the jug. She went to work on the kitchen first because it was the most immediate need, and because work was something she could do without having to think too hard about her situation. She scrubbed the grease off the stove and the grime off the floor and found, in a back cupboard, 2 cracked clay bowls and a Dutch oven with a warped lid that still functioned tolerably if you weighted it down. She made soup from dried beans and a knob of smoked pork she found hanging in the cold room. She found a jar of preserved tomatoes on a shelf, the glass filmed with dust, and when she opened it and smelled it, she felt for the first time in weeks something close to optimism. Silas came in at noon and looked at the kitchen and then at the soup. "You didn't have to start today," he said. "It needed doing." He sat down at the table and ate 2 bowls of soup without saying much. Lily sat across from him, eating her own bowl with the focused attention she gave food when she was genuinely hungry, which was most of the time these days. Silas watched her in the way Elena was beginning to recognize. Not staring, just aware, with the same careful, peripheral attention he gave everything on the ranch. "Do you like tomatoes?" Lily asked him. "I do." "Mama says they're medicine." Probably true. She says everything she puts in soup is medicine, even the beans. "Beans are definitely medicine," Silas said, and the corner of his mouth moved slightly in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Lily considered him across the table. "Do you have any children?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Elena saw Silas's hand pause on his spoon, just for a half second, just enough to know she'd seen it. "No," he said. "My papa is gone," Lily said, with the matter-of-fact directness that children use for truths that have already been fully processed. "Mama says he's not coming back." "I'm sorry to hear that," Silas said. "It's okay. He wasn't very nice." Elena kept her eyes on her soup. This was true, and it was also the kind of truth that she'd never coached Lily to say. It had simply emerged, the way a child's version of things always emerges, clean and unadorned because children don't yet know which truths are the ones you're supposed to dress up before showing to people. Silas didn't press it. He finished his soup, thanked her for it with a brevity that was sincere rather than dismissive, and went back out to work. She found the grave on the 4th day. It was behind the house, maybe 60 yards up the slope, at the edge of the pines where the ground leveled off briefly before climbing again. 2 markers. One for a woman, Nora Boon, 1849 to 1882, and one smaller, beside it, for an infant. The smaller marker had no name, just a date and a dash that went nowhere. Elena stood in the snow and looked at them for a while. She wasn't sure what she felt. Not quite sadness, because she hadn't known these people, but something adjacent to sadness, the way you can feel the shape of a loss without knowing its particular weight. An infant. She looked at the small marker's date and did the arithmetic and understood. The same year. Nora had died having the baby. The baby had died too. She stood there a moment longer, then went back down to start the afternoon's work. That evening, when Silas came in for supper, she didn't say anything about the graves, But something in her posture or her eyes must have told him, because he looked at her once, carefully, and then looked away. And there was something in that exchange, wordless and brief, that was more honest than most conversations she'd had in years. By the end of the second week, she had the main house functioning at something close to order. The kitchen was clean and organized. She'd found lumber in the barn, and with some trial and significantly more air than she would have liked, managed to repair the wobbling table leg in the cabin and jury-rig a second shelf in the kitchen, because the one shelf was inadequate, and Silas had never gotten around to the proper one. She'd mended 3 of his work shirts where the seams had gone and darned a pair of socks from Lily's bundle that had developed holes she'd been ignoring for a month. The ranch itself was a serious operation, bigger than she'd understood at first glance. Silas ran about 120 head of cattle on a spread that climbed from the valley floor up through 2 different grass benches into the pine foothills. He worked it with a single hired hand named Cord, a lean, taciturn man of 40 who chewed tobacco and communicated primarily through a vocabulary of grunts that Elena was slowly beginning to parse. Cord slept in the bunkhouse and took his meals there too, which meant Elena cooked twice, once for the main house and once a pot that Cord collected at noon and evening from the kitchen door without coming inside. An arrangement that suited everyone. The work was genuine. She'd been right to take him at his word on that, but there were other things she hadn't anticipated. She hadn't anticipated Lily's effect on the place. A child's presence on a quiet ranch has a way of rearranging the air. Not just the noise, though there was that, but the whole quality of being there. Lily explored everything. She followed Cord around the yard with a stream of questions he handled with surprising patience. She learned the horses' names within 24 hours and was already feeding the gentler one, a bay gelding named August, from her hand. She discovered that the barn had kittens and spent 2 mornings negotiating with their feral mother before winning enough trust to touch them. And she talked to Silas, constantly, without apparent awareness that this might not be desired. Silas did not, to Elena's initial surprise, seem to find it unwelcome. He answered Lily's questions with the same economy he brought to everything else, precisely, without embellishment, without condescension. When Lily asked him why the mountains turned pink at sunset, he told her it was the way light bent when it traveled a long distance, and how the red end of it bent more than the blue. When she asked why calves were born with their eyes already open, he said that prey animals needed to be ready fast, and that cattle were prey animals, even if they didn't look it. When she asked if he was lonely, there was a pause that went on just long enough to mean something, and then he said, "Less than I was." Elena heard this from the kitchen doorway and went back inside and found something to do with her hands. The town's disapproval followed them up the ranch road like a cold front. She'd known it would. You didn't escape from a place like Harlan Creek by putting 4 miles between yourself and it. You just changed the proximity of the problem. The problem itself stayed attached. The first sign was when the supply wagon from the dry goods store failed to arrive on the first Tuesday, which was the day Silas had arranged it. He drove in himself, said nothing about it when he got back. The second sign was when Cord mentioned, without elaboration, that someone had been asking about who was keeping house up at the Boon place. The third sign was when Elena went into town herself, with Lily, to get thread from Hatch's store, and found 3 women in the dry goods who went quiet in a specific way when she came in. Not embarrassed quiet, but intentional quiet. The kind that was meant to be felt. She bought her thread. She kept her voice pleasant. She got out. On the walk back to where she'd tied the wagon, she passed the bank. Calvin Mercer was standing in the doorway of it, which was unusual. Calvin Mercer was not a man who stood in doorways. He was a man who sat behind desks with deliberate importance. He was watching her. He had pale eyes and a close-trimmed beard and the soft, careful face of a man who had decided early that money was more reliable than people. He looked at Elena, and then his eyes moved to Lily, and he didn't say anything. But his looking had an intention in it that she recognized and didn't like. She kept walking. That night, after Lily was asleep, she sat at the cabin table with her mending and tried to think clearly about her situation. The warmth was real. The safety was real, too. Relative safety, the only kind that existed, but real within that qualifier. Lily was eating. Lily was sleeping. Lily was teaching herself to whistle in the barn in the afternoons, and had named 2 of the kittens, and was conducting a patient campaign to convince Silas to let her keep the orange one in the cabin. These were things that mattered. These were things that had not been true 3 weeks ago. But she knew what was building in town. She'd watched it build before, in a different town, and she knew its stages. First the looking, then the whispers, then the withholding, credit, commerce, civility, then something more organized, more deliberate. People like Calvin Mercer didn't run on gossip alone. They ran on leverage, and they were patient about finding it. She was careful to be nothing that could be used. She didn't know if that would be enough. It was on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week, the snow coming down hard and the wind working at the cabin roof in the way that reminded her how thin the line was between shelter and exposure, that she heard a knock at the cabin door. She opened it. Silas stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, which was the first time she'd seen him without it, and which made him look, briefly and oddly, younger. "I need to ask you something," he said, "about what's being said in town." She opened the door wider. "Come in." He came in but didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the small room with the air of a man delivering something he'd prepared carefully. "Mercer's been telling people you stole from your last employer," he said. "That's where the talk started. I want to know if it's true." She looked at him. She'd had this conversation before, in spirit if not in these exact words, and she'd learned that there were 2 ways to have it: the defensive way, which bought nothing, and the direct way, which occasionally bought something and occasionally bought nothing but at least cost her less. "No," she said. "It's not true. I worked for the Crane family in Dalton for 14 months. I left because Robert Crane, the son, not the father, had decided that my being in the house was an invitation I hadn't extended. When I told his father, he chose his son. When I threatened to tell his wife, he told me I could leave or he would see to it that I couldn't get work in the territory." She paused. "He was better connected than I expected," she said. Silas stood in the center of the room looking at her. His face did not change, but something behind it did. "Did the son hurt you?" "Not the way you mean. Tried to. Didn't. But it followed you here." "These things follow you," she said. "That's how it works. A man with money and connections tells a story, and the story gets there before you do, and by the time you arrive, everyone's already decided." Silas was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind pushed at the wall. "I believe you," he said. She hadn't expected the plainness of it. She'd expected qualifications, the diplomatic softening that people used when they half believed you and didn't want to commit. Just, "I believe you." "All right," she said. "I'm going to tell Cord," he said. "So he knows. And I'm going to go see Mercer." "You don't have to fight I'm not fighting your fight," he said. "I'm telling a man to stop spreading lies about a woman in my employ. That's different." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without difficulty. "You're a strange man, Silas Boon," she said. "Probably," he said. He put his hat back on. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." "Good night," she said. After the door closed, she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and felt the solidity of it, the repair she'd made to the leg, the way it didn't wobble anymore. Outside, the snow kept coming. In the main house, she could see through the cabin window the lamp glow of a man who had decided something and was done deciding it. She sat there for a while in the warmth, listening to the storm work itself out against the logs, and thought about what it meant to be believed by someone who didn't owe you anything. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. Maybe it had never happened at all. She blew out her own lamp and went to check that Lily was covered, tucking the quilt around her daughter's shoulders with the careful economy of a woman who has learned not to take small comforts for granted. Lily slept deeply, her breath steady and slow, one arm thrown over the orange kitten that had somehow migrated from the barn to the cabin bed over the past 3 days without anyone acknowledging that it had happened. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she went to bed herself, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, she slept without waking up at every sound. The orange kitten got a name on a Sunday morning. Lily announced it at breakfast, with the gravity of someone making a legal declaration. "His name is Copper, because he's the color of a penny, and because pennies are good luck and we need some." Silas looked up from his coffee. "That's a reasonable name." "I know," Lily said. "I thought about it for 3 days." Elena set a plate of biscuits on the table and said nothing, because the kitten had been sleeping in the cabin for a week already, and the naming of it was the least consequential thing happening, and also, somehow, the thing that made the whole arrangement feel most real. You named things you intended to keep. That was what naming was for. The weeks had layered themselves into something resembling routine, and routine, she had learned, was its own kind of mercy. There was a rhythm to the ranch that the cold enforced, the early dark that drove everyone inside, the mornings that required moving before you were ready to move, the way hunger and work and the body's need for warmth created a structure that didn't leave much room for the kind of thinking that didn't do you any good. She cooked and cleaned and mended and found, gradually, that the homestead had been waiting for attention the way neglected things wait, with a kind of exhausted patience, ready to respond once someone decided to start. She'd rebuilt the kitchen shelf properly, using lumber from a pile Silas kept under the barn overhang. She'd re-chinked a gap in the cabin's north wall that had been letting in a finger of cold air. She'd organized the cold room by type and date, found preserves she hadn't known were there, discovered a crockery jar of dried herbs behind the others that still smelled faintly of something she couldn't name, but which she added to a pot of venison stew, and which Silas ate 2 bowls of without comment, though he looked at the pot afterward in a way she chose not to interpret too closely. The ranch itself responded to her presence the way living things respond to being tended. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about cleaning a grease-filmed stove or repairing a fence rail that had been leaning at a bad angle all autumn. But incrementally, the way a sick animal rallies, one small sign at a time. Cord watched all of this from the side. He didn't say much, Cord never said much, but his grunts had shifted in quality, she'd noticed. The ones he aimed at her in the morning had a different register than they had in the first days, when they'd been the grunts of a man reserving judgment. Now they were something closer to acknowledgement. She counted this as progress. Thus, what she hadn't anticipated, what she couldn't have predicted, was what the ranch did to Lily. The girl transformed. There was no other word for it. In town, she'd been quiet in the specific way of a child who has learned that quiet is safer, who has absorbed from the air around her the particular tension of being somewhere she wasn't quite wanted. On the ranch, she became something else. She became loud and curious and physical in a way she hadn't been allowed to be, and it was startling sometimes, hearing that laugh, wide open and unguarded, come sailing out of the barn or across the yard. She learned the horses first. Then she learned the calves, the ones in the near pasture that would let you approach if you moved slow and held your hand out flat. She learned where Cord kept the good rope and how to coil it, which he showed her once, and which she practiced until she could do it without thinking. She learned that August the gelding liked to be scratched behind his left ear, and that the spotted mare in the middle stall, whose name was Ida, would bite if you came at her head on, but was gentle if you approached from the shoulder, and she talked to Silas. This had not stopped. If anything, it had increased, with the confidence of a child who has established that a particular adult will not tell her to go away. Elena witnessed most of these conversations in pieces, from the kitchen window, from across the yard, from the doorway of the barn. Silas would be doing something with his hands, fixing a hinge, sorting tack, checking a horse's hoof, and Lily would be nearby, talking, and he would be answering, and neither of them seemed to find anything unusual about the arrangement. She overheard, one afternoon, a conversation that she didn't mean to eavesdrop on, but that stopped her at the barn door as sure as a hand on her arm. "Do you miss her?" Lily was asking. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, watching Silas work a saddle with a piece of conditioning leather. The question was direct in the way that was Lily's characteristic. No approach, just arrival. A pause. "Yes," Silas said. "Every day?" "Some days more than others." "Mama says that's how it works," Lily said thoughtfully. "That it doesn't go away, it just changes shape, like ice to water." Silas's hand stilled on the saddle. Then he resumed. "Your mama's smart." "I know, she figured out the stove thing." "What stove thing?" "The one that was smoking. She figured out the flue was turned wrong. She didn't tell you because she thought you'd be embarrassed that you didn't notice." There was a silence. "I see," Silas said. "I probably wasn't supposed to say that." "Probably not." He set down the cloth and looked at her. "Do you miss your father?" Lily thought about this with the seriousness she brought to serious things. "Not really," she said finally. I miss what I thought he was going to be. Is that the same? Silas looked at her for a moment. No, he said. That's different. And it's harder, in some ways. That's what I think too, Lily said, apparently satisfied to have this confirmed. Copper has fleas, she added, pivoting cleanly. I found 3 of them. I'll get the powder from the barn cabinet, he said. And the conversation moved on, but Elena stayed at the barn door another moment before she turned and went back to the kitchen. She didn't examine what she felt. She was careful about that. February arrived and doubled down on everything December had started. The temperature dropped below what the thermometer outside the kitchen window was calibrated to read, which meant the mercury had vanished below the scale entirely, and the world existed in a range that the instrument could only describe as worse than this. The creek that ran along the east edge of the property, a cheerful, unremarkable thing in warmer months, went silent under a lid of ice that thickened daily until it didn't look like ice anymore, just like ground that was darker than the surrounding ground. Silas's concern about the cattle dominated the days. He and Cord spent most of their hours breaking ice on the water troughs, moving vulnerable animals to the south pasture, where a natural windbreak of rock and pine cut the worst of the exposure, moving hay from the upper barn to where it could be reached. Elena kept food running, kept the kitchen stove going around the clock, kept hot coffee available at any hour, began baking extra bread on the theory that cold men needed more than cold men realized. Lily was confined indoors more than she liked, which she handled with imperfect grace. I want to go to the creek, she announced one Wednesday afternoon, the particular flat tone of a child who has been inside too long. The creek is frozen, Elena said, without looking up from the shirt she was mending. I know it's frozen. I want to see it. You've seen it. I want to see it today. Elena looked up. Lily was standing in the middle of the cabin in her coat and hat, which she'd put on while Elena wasn't watching, demonstrating a level of premeditation that was difficult to argue with. 20 minutes, Elena said. Stay back from the edge. I mean it, Lily. Back from the edge. I know, Lily said, already at the door. Back from the... The door closed. Elena looked at the empty room for a moment, then returned to the shirt. She was 7 stitches into the collar repair when something, she would never be able to identify what exactly, whether it was sound or the absence of sound or some other signal that registered below consciousness, made her put the shirt down. She went to the window and looked at the yard and didn't see Lily, which was not unusual except that there was a quality to the air that was. She went outside. The yard was empty. The barn was quiet. She stood on the cabin porch and turned east toward the creek and began walking before she'd made a conscious decision to walk. She was halfway there when she heard it, a sound that is specific and unmistakable, and that parents recognize before they can name it, a high, sharp sound that wasn't a scream exactly, that was a sound being cut off by something worse than the sound itself. She ran. The creek bank was 15 feet of slope down to the ice. She took it at an angle, sliding the last few feet, grabbing a pine branch to slow herself, and looked down the frozen surface and saw the place where the ice had given way. A dark, ragged hole, 6 feet from the bank, where the current ran faster and the freeze was shallower than it looked. Lily's hands were on the ice edge. Her face was above water, but only just, her coat soaked and dragging, her expression locked into the silent, rigid panic of someone whose body is too cold to do what her mind is telling it to do. Lily! Elena was already on her stomach on the ice, reaching. Lily, grab my hand. Grab my hand. I can't. Lily's voice was barely there. I can't feel. You don't need to feel it. Grab. She reached further. The ice cracked in 2 places near her hip, and she felt the surface shift and didn't stop reaching. Her fingers found Lily's wrist and closed. She heard boots on the bank behind her, a slid and crash of someone coming down faster than she had, and then Silas was beside her on the ice and past her, flat on his stomach, with his arm down into the water, and he didn't say anything, didn't tell Lily to hold on or that it would be okay, just got his arm under her coat and pulled. The ice gave way under him. He went into the water to his shoulder, braced his free arm on the remaining solid edge, and came back up with Lily against his chest. Elena got back from the water's edge, and he put Lily into her arms. Then he pulled himself out, which took longer than it should have, his coat and boots full of water, his face entirely without expression in the way of someone who has put all available resources elsewhere. She was already moving up the bank. She didn't look back to check if he was following because she couldn't look back. Inside the cabin, she stripped Lily's wet clothes off with hands that were shaking in a way she couldn't control, wrapped her in every blanket she owned, got the stove as hot as it would go. Lily was shuddering hard, the deep, total body shaking that means the cold has gotten to the core. "Stay awake," Elena said. "Lily, look at me. Stay awake." "I'm sorry," Lily said through chattering teeth. "I went to look and the ice Don't talk about it yet. Just stay awake." Silas appeared at the door, having stripped his wet coat somewhere between the creek and here, shirt dark with water, his color not right. He came in and went directly to the stove and stood in front of it with his back to the room. "She needs warm liquid," he said. "Not hot. Warm. I know." Elena was already at the stove, moving him aside without ceremony to get to the pot. She got water on and added what she had. Some dried herbs, a piece of hard candy from Lily's pocket that she'd been keeping for special occasions, and which she added to the water without asking. She brought the cup to Lily, helped her hold it, watched her drink. Over Lily's head, her eyes met Silas's. He was standing in the middle of the room now, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, shaken. Not visibly, not in any way that most people would identify, but she'd been watching him for 8 weeks, and she knew his baseline, and he was not at his baseline. There was something in his face that had come loose from its housing, something that the cold water and the speed of what had happened, and maybe the sight of a child going through ice, had knocked out of whatever place he kept it stored. She couldn't look at him for very long because Lily needed her attention, but she saw it. She kept her hand steady for Lily's sake and let her own relief exist somewhere below the surface, where it wouldn't interfere with what needed doing. It took 2 hours before Lily's color came fully back. By then she was drowsy and inclined towards sleep, which Elena allowed, sitting beside her on the cot until her breathing evened out. Silas had, at some point, gone to the main house and returned in dry clothes. He came back to the cabin with a second lamp and sat at the table without being invited, which was the first time he'd done that. They sat in the quiet for a while. The stove ticked.
"Thank you," Elena said finally. "I had her wrist, but I don't know if I could have gotten her up alone. The ice was—" "You were already on the ice when I got there," he said. "You were reaching into the water. I was trying to. With the ice cracking under you." She looked at him. "She's mine."
He held her gaze. Something passed across his face that she didn't have a word for. Not quite grief, not quite admiration, not quite recognition. All of them, maybe. The residue of 4 years of not having anyone to be this way about. "I know," he said. "I know she is." They didn't say anything else for a while. It was Silas who finally spoke, his voice level and with the careful quality of a man handing something fragile to someone he's decided he can trust with it. "She was born in November," he said. "The baby. The same night as Nora. It went wrong fast and there was nothing. The doctor was 30 miles away and by the time—" He stopped. Then, "I couldn't save either of them." Elena kept very still. "I've spent 4 years thinking that was the thing that defined me," he said. "The thing I couldn't do. The man who couldn't—" He stopped again. "Today was different." "Yes," she said quietly. "It was." He nodded once, to himself more than to her, and looked at Lily sleeping. The lamp between them put a circle of light on the table. Outside, the cold held the world in its grip, and the creek ran dark under its lid of ice. And in the cabin, the three of them existed inside the same small, warm radius, the silence a different quality than it had been before. Not empty, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who have just said something important and are letting it settle. March came in sideways, the way it does at altitude. Not a clean turn toward warmth, but a grudging negotiation, 2 days of thaw followed by 3 days of freeze, the snow pulling back in patches and then reasserting itself, the world perpetually half-decided. But the light changed. That was the first and most reliable sign, the way the late afternoon sun found a different angle against the hillside and held it longer. The way the mornings began carrying a quality that wasn't quite warmth, but was the memory of warmth. The suggestion that such a thing was possible again. Elena noticed it in the animals first. August started getting restless in the early evenings. The cattle in the south pasture began drifting toward the fence on the north side,
instinctively leaning toward grass that wasn't there yet. Copper, who had spent the deep winter sleeping approximately 18 hours a day on whatever warm surface presented itself, began going outside in the afternoons and coming back smelling of pine and something damp and alive. And in the house, things shifted too. Not dramatically. Nothing about the way Silas Boon operated was dramatic. She'd come to understand that his version of change was internal first and visible only later, only in accumulation. But she noticed the way he was present in the evenings now in a different way than he'd been in January, the way he'd started staying at the kitchen table after supper instead of taking his coffee and going to the other room. The way he'd begun talking. Not a lot. Not in the way of a man suddenly discovering that he had things to say, but in the way of a man who has remembered that talking to someone is something human beings do, and that it doesn't have to cost you anything to do it. He told her about the ranch, not the logistics of it, which she'd absorbed through 8 weeks of daily observation, but the history of it, where he'd come from, a small settlement in the eastern lowlands, his father's failing grain farm, the particular way he'd understood as a teenager that grain was not going to be his future. How he'd come west at 19 with $40 and considerable stubbornness and had worked 3 different ranches before staking his own claim in this valley, because the grass was good and the water was reliable, and because there was something about the particular angle of the mountains at the head of the valley that made him want to stay in a way no other place had. And Nora? Elena asked once, carefully. She was from Harlan Creek, he said. Her family had been there since near the beginning. I met her at a 4th of July dance. She could tell I didn't know how to dance, and she thought that was funny. He looked at his coffee. She could make a good day better and a bad day bearable. I've never had that since. He paused. I didn't expect to. Elena looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them again, the way it always was. What changed? She asked. Not what she meant exactly, but he understood it. Lily, he said after a moment. Lily happened, and then... He stopped, looked at his hands, and then other things. He looked up at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything else. And it was the most honest conversation she'd had in years, despite the fact that most of it had gone unspoken. The thaw that finally stuck came in the last week of March, sudden and convincing after weeks of half measures, and with it the particular energy of a ranch coming back to life. New calves started arriving. Cord, who had been compressed all winter into a version of himself that was even quieter than usual, expanded back into his normal range and could be heard occasionally whistling something tuneless in the barn. The horses moved differently in the pasture, looser, with a kind of loose-limbed enthusiasm that was almost embarrassing to watch, and Elena found herself standing at the kitchen window one morning, looking at the yard filling up with pale March light, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was close to happiness. Not happiness exactly. It was thinner than that, more tentative, the kind of feeling you approach sideways because you've been burned by approaching it directly. But something in that range, something that had to do with the smell of coffee and the sound of Lily in the barn talking to August and the fact that the creek was running again, free of ice, visible from the kitchen window as a bright moving thread along the east tree line. She was still standing there when Silas came in from the morning's work, and he stopped when he saw her face, and she turned around and probably her expression told him something, because his own expression did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, something that she could only describe as opening, as though a door inside it had been unlocked. Neither of them moved toward the other. They were not those people, not yet, probably not ever in the ways that required rushing toward, but there was something in the standing there, in the facing each other in the morning light, that was itself a kind of declaration, quiet and unwitnessed and entirely their own. The calves are coming fast, he said finally. I'm going to need more help in the afternoons. I can manage the afternoons, she said. I know you can, he said. And then he poured his coffee and sat down, and she went back to cooking. And if there was a difference in the quality of the room, it was not one that either of them pointed at directly, which was exactly right. What she hadn't been watching closely enough was Harlan Creek. She should have been. She knew better. But the ranch had its own gravity, its own pull toward the present and immediate, and she'd let herself settle too deeply into it without keeping one eye on the distance. The first messenger was Dorothy Gill, who came up the ranch road on a Wednesday afternoon in early April with a pie and an expression that was doing 2 things at once,
trying to be friendly and trying to deliver bad news, and who managed both imperfectly. Dorothy was a woman Elena had spoken to twice in town, briefly, the kind of person who wasn't cruel but wasn't brave either, and who had stood on both sides of the line, depending on which side felt safer that week. She had a husband who fixed wagons and a daughter Lily's age, and she had apparently made some private decision. She stood at the cabin door with the pie and said, "I thought you should know what's being said." "I'd rather sit down for it," Elena said. "Come in." What was being said was specific. Calvin Mercer had been telling people that Elena Whitmore had stolen money from the Crane family in Dalton. Not just the vague theft claim she'd heard before, but a specific amount that matched, coincidentally, the expansion the Cranes had recently made to their property. The story was detailed enough to sound researched. It had the quality of a lie that someone has spent time building, adding specific numbers and dates the way you add furniture to a house. Not because the furniture is real, but because empty houses feel unconvincing. "He's been talking to the bank's correspondent in Dalton," Dorothy said. She held her cup of coffee with both hands. "My husband heard from a man who does business with Mercer. There's a letter." "What kind of letter?" "A letter from Robert Crane's father, saying things." Dorothy looked uncomfortable. "I don't know if the letter is real. I thought you should know." After Dorothy left, Elena sat at the table for a long time. The pie sat between her and the empty chair. She didn't eat any of it. She understood what was happening. She'd understood in abstract that it would happen eventually, but she'd let herself be lulled into thinking she had more time. Mercer wasn't random in his dislike of her. There was something specific in it, some interest being protected, and she needed to think carefully about what that interest was. Men like Calvin Mercer didn't invest in ruining people for entertainment. They invested in it because the ruining served something. She was still sitting there when Lily came in from the barn. Lily looked at the pie, then at Elena's face, and sat down in the opposite chair with the careful gravity of a child who has learned to read rooms. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Thinking," Elena said. "About what?" Elena looked at her daughter across the table. Lily's face had changed in these months. Still a child's face, but a different quality to it. Less cautious, more open. The ranch had done that. The animals, the space, the particular combination of people that had surrounded her through the hardest winter months. She looked like a child who had learned to trust the ground under her feet, which was the most valuable thing Elena could think of anyone learning. She was not going to let Calvin Mercer take that away. "Nothing for you to worry about," Elena said, which was also true. "How were the calves today?" "Silas let me name one," Lily said, perking immediately. "The little white-faced one with the crooked ear." "What did you name it?" Lily grinned. "March." "After the month?" "After how it felt when the ice melted," Lily said, as though this was obvious. Elena looked at her daughter for a moment, and something turned over in her chest. Something large and warm, and not entirely comfortable. The particular love that parents carry, which is the love most saturated with fear because it is the love with the most to lose. "That's a good name," she said. Lily cut herself a piece of pie with a child's confident disregard for appropriate slice size, and Elena watched her eat it and held what she'd learned from Dorothy as you hold something hot, carefully, away from everything else, until you can figure out what to do with it. She would have to tell Silas. She knew that. But tonight she'd let them have supper and let Lily tell Silas about the calf named March, and she'd let the lamplight do what it did in the evenings now, which was make the room feel like something worth defending. Tomorrow was soon enough for the rest of it. She told him the next morning. Lily was in the barn with Cord, who had taken on the task of teaching her to properly halter a horse with the resigned competence of a man who knows resistance is futile and has decided to make himself useful instead. Elena waited until she could see them through the kitchen window, Lily's small figure beside Cord's lean one in the barn doorway, before she turned to where Silas was finishing his coffee at the table. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down the cup. He didn't say, "Go ahead," or "What is it?" He just looked at her with that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that made you feel the space had cleared itself. She told him about Dorothy Gill's visit, about the letter, about Calvin Mercer, and the specific lie he was building in Dalton. The way it had details now, numbers, a correspondent, the architecture of something that had been constructed rather than merely repeated. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Lily saying something to Cord in the particular tone she used when she was explaining something she believed he didn't know, which was a tone she used frequently and which Cord received with more patience than most adults would have. "How long has Mercer been doing this?" Silas asked. The vague version started in December. Dorothy says the letter is recent, last 2 weeks, which means he's escalating. Yes. Silas turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. She'd come to recognize this gesture. It was what he did when he was thinking something through that he needed to think through before he said it, the external version of a process that was mostly internal. "Do you know why him specifically?" he asked. "Why Mercer?" She'd thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since Dorothy left, the pie half-eaten on the table, running it back through what she knew, what she'd seen. "I think it might be the land," she said. "When I came into town in December before you, I was asking about work. One of the places I asked at was the land office. They have a notice board. There were 3 properties with delinquent tax notices. Yours was one of them." Silas went still. "I didn't think anything of it at the time," she said. "I was looking for any kind of work that was listed, but afterward, when I thought about Mercer and how specific his interest in me seemed—" "He wants the land," Silas said. "I think he's been wanting it. I think the taxes are an opportunity he's been watching, and I think my being here changed something for him." She looked at Silas steadily. "Before I came, you were a man alone on a working ranch with a tax problem. That's manageable from his perspective. He waits, the taxes accumulate, eventually there's a legal mechanism. But a man who has help, who has the house running and more hands available, is a man who might catch up," Silas said. "Yes." He was quiet again. She watched him absorb this and rearrange what he knew around it, and come out the other side with something that was close to anger, but not anger exactly, more like the cold, resolved feeling that comes after anger has burned off and left its useful residue. "The taxes," he said. "I need to show you something." He went to the back room, the small one off the main bedroom that he used as a kind of office. A desk, a shelf of ledgers, a tin box she'd never asked about. He came back with a paper and set it on the table between them. It was a tax notice. The amount was not catastrophic, but it wasn't small either. 2 seasons of partial payment. The kind of deficit that accumulates when a man is working hard enough to keep the operation alive, but not hard enough to get ahead of it. "I was going to make it up this spring," he said, "with the cattle sale." "When's the sale?" "June. The buyer comes through in June." She looked at the paper. "And the notice deadline?" "May 15th. She did the math. It was tight. Not impossible, but tight, and that was before any of Mercer's interference reached the cattle buyer or the cattle market, or anyone else with a financial interest in the outcome. "He doesn't have to beat you," she said. "He just has to slow you down enough." "I know. So what do we do?" He looked at her across the table, and she noticed, not for the first time, but more sharply than usual, that he'd stopped looking at her the way a man looks at an employee somewhere around the 4th week of February, that something had shifted in the quality of it without either of them naming the shift. "We work," he said, "faster than we were, and I ride into town and have a conversation with Mercer that I should have had 2 months ago." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where I make clear that I know what he's doing and that I'm not going to make it easy." He paused. "I'm not a man who likes that kind of conversation, but I'm more comfortable with it than I used to be." She thought he was going to say something else, but he picked up the tax notice and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, and that was apparently the end of that. He rode into Harlan Creek alone, which was his choice and which she didn't argue with. She spent the morning doing what she would have spent the morning doing anyway. The laundry, the kitchen floor, a broken latch on the cold room door that she'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. The work had the benefit of being physical enough to keep the worst of the waiting at bay. Lily found her on the cold room floor with the latch component spread on the ground beside her. "Where's Silas?" Lily asked. "Town." "Why?" "Business." Lily sat down cross-legged on the cold room threshold and watched Elena work with the frank, evaluative interest she brought to most mechanical processes. "Is he going to be okay?" Elena looked up. "Why wouldn't he be?" "Dorothy came yesterday," Lily said, "and you had a face." "What kind of face?"
The kind you have when something's wrong, but you don't want to say so. Elena looked at her daughter for a moment. The accuracy of children was something she never fully adjusted to, the way they saw what they saw without the social training that teaches adults to pretend they're seeing something else. "He'll be fine," she said. "Hand me that pin." Lily handed her the pin. "Is it about the town?" she asked. "The people who don't like us?" "Some of them don't like us," Elena said, working the pin into the latch housing. "Some of them just don't know us. That's different. Dorothy seems like she knows us a little. Dorothy is complicated." The pin slipped and she readjusted. "Some people are on the right side of things, but they take a while to get there. Dorothy might be one of those." "And the banker man? The one with the pale eyes?" Elena stilled for a half-second. "What do you know about him?" "I saw him looking at you last time we were in town. He has a mean-looking face. Not mean like angry, mean like—" Lily searched for the word with a child's frustrated precision. "Mean like he's doing arithmetic about people." Elena looked at her daughter, 7 years old and already fluent in the language of men who calculated. She didn't know whether to be proud or heartbroken. "You're right about him," she said. "Stay away from him." "I do anyway," Lily said. "Copper keeps me company." She handed Elena the next piece without being asked, and they worked together in the thin April sun until the latch was fixed. Silas came back from town in the late afternoon with the particular quality of a man who has done something necessary and unpleasant and is past it. He unsaddled his horse and came into the kitchen and poured water from the pitcher and stood at the window drinking it before he spoke. "I talked to Mercer," he said. "How'd that go?" "About how I expected." He set the glass down. "He's a careful man. He didn't say anything I could use against him. Mostly he smiled and talked about the community's welfare and suggested, in the way that men like him suggest things without saying them, that my situation at the ranch was irregular. Meaning me. Meaning you." He turned from the window. He also mentioned that there are questions being asked about whether the Boon spread is being operated in accordance with certain county ordinances around, and I'm using his word, habitation. There's apparently an ordinance about unmarried women residing on a property. Elena looked at him. "Is there actually such an ordinance?" "I don't know. I've never heard of one. But that's not the point. The point is that Mercer has enough friends and enough positions that if he wants to create a problem that looks like an ordinance problem, he can probably do that without too much difficulty." "He's manufacturing the law," she said. "He's manufacturing the appearance of the law, which in a small town can amount to the same thing." She sat down at the table. She'd known this was coming, in some form. She'd known it the way you know a storm is coming. Not the specifics, but the general direction and certainty of it. "I have one option that solves most of this," Silas said. He was still standing at the window, still holding the empty glass with both hands. He had the look of a man who had decided something on a long ride home and was now standing at the edge of having said it. She waited. "I'm not going to suggest it tonight," he said. I want to be sure it comes from the right place. Not just because it solves the problem. That wouldn't be—" He stopped. Put the glass on the counter with unusual care. "Not yet." She understood him. Or she understood enough. She nodded once and went back to starting supper, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. But the shape of the unspoken thing sat in the room with them all through dinner and after, and it wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the shape of something that had a name neither of them was quite ready to say out loud. April turned into a different kind of war. It didn't happen with any single dramatic event. It happened the way these things happen in small communities, through accumulation, through the steady application of social and economic pressure until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. The first week, 2 of Silas's 3 seasonal ranch hands, men he'd hired in previous years and who had been expected to return in April for the spring work, sent word that they weren't coming. No explanation from either one, just word, delivered through a third party, that their circumstances had changed. Silas hired new men, strangers, men who came looking for work. He hired them and put them to work and didn't ask questions about why their predecessors had changed their minds, though the answer was apparent enough. The second week, the feed merchant in Harlan Creek, a man named Pollard who had done business with the Boon Ranch for going on 7 years, sent back a supply order unfilled.
The note with it said only that Pollard Supplies could no longer extend the customary 30-day account terms and would require cash at time of order. Cash at time of order was not the way ranch supply worked in practice. It never had been, because ranches ran on credit advanced against cattle sales the same way most of the frontier economy ran on credit advanced against future production. Requiring cash up front from a cattle rancher in April was not a business decision. It was a message. Silas paid in cash. He had enough for that, though it was not comfortable to spend it. The third week, Cord came in from town on a Thursday evening and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw working in a way Elena had learned to read as the precursor to something that pained him. "Need to talk to you," he said. "Sit down, Cord." He sat. He put his hat on the table, which he almost never did. He looked at it. "I've got my brother's situation," he said, "down in the valley. He's got a debt thing, and I'm supposed to... I've been thinking about going down there. Help him sort it." Elena looked at him steadily. "Cord?" He looked up, which was what she'd been waiting for. "What did Mercer offer you?" she asked. He went still. Then the muscle in his jaw moved again, and he looked back at his hat. "Didn't say it was Mercer. What did he offer?" A long pause. "Said there might be work at the Double H," he said. "The Halverson place. Better wages, more regular." He shook his head slowly. "I've been with Silas 6 years." "I know you have. 6 years is a long time." "It is." He looked at her. Cord was not a man who expressed things with his face in any obvious way, but he had a face, and it was doing something now. "What's going to happen?" he asked. "To you all?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I know that Silas has been running this place for 11 years, and he's not going to stop because Calvin Mercer wants his land." Cord looked at his hat for another long moment. "I don't need better wages," he said finally. "I need what I already got to not fall apart." "I know." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 minutes. "Then go eat your supper," she said. "It's getting cold." He took his hat and left. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and then turned and finished the dishes with hands that were not entirely steady. The accusation arrived in writing on a Friday, delivered to the ranch by a man Elena didn't recognize who handed a sealed envelope to Silas at the fence line and left without speaking. Silas brought it to the kitchen table and opened it in front of her. It was a letter on bank letterhead, Calvin Mercer's letterhead. It referenced in the careful language that men use when they want to sound official without being legally accountable, the outstanding tax situation on the Boon property. And it noted that the bank, as a concerned creditor in the community, had received information suggesting that a recent arrival to the Boon household had prior to her arrival misappropriated funds from a previous employer. The letter said the bank could not in good conscience continue to provide services to a property where questions of moral character were unresolved, and that it would be reviewing its relationship with the Boon Ranch pending clarification. Silas read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "He's pulling the ranch's credit line," Elena said. "He hasn't pulled it yet. He's threatening to. There's a difference, but without credit, the June sale doesn't matter because you can't get to June." "That's about right." She looked at the letter. The language was impeccable. There was nothing in it that was technically a lie, and nothing in it that could be legally challenged with any confidence, and nothing in it that didn't accomplish exactly what it was designed to accomplish. "He's good at this," she said. "Men like him are always good at this," Silas said. "They practice it their whole lives." She looked at him across the letter. "Silas, what I said before, about not wanting you to fight my—" "You're not going to say that again," he said quietly, but with a finality that settled it. She wasn't going to argue. She looked at her hands on the table and thought about what she had, what actual resources she had, not what she wished she had, but what was real and available and usable. She had the truth, which was not nothing, but which was also not, in isolation, sufficient. She had the letter from Dorothy, which was a warning, not evidence. She had Robert Crane, who was in Dalton, and his father, who had written the original letter, and the fact that what they had said about her was a lie. But the fact of it being a lie needed to be demonstrable, and demonstrating it required someone in Dalton willing to say so. And she was not in Dalton and didn't have money to get there. She had Silas, which was different from having a resource. He was not a resource. He was a person, which was both more and less reliable. She looked at the wall. Then she said, "There was a woman in Dalton. Her name is Florence Hewitt. She worked in the same household I did, as a seamstress who came in twice a week. She saw what happened with Robert Crane. She told me afterward that she'd seen his behavior with other women employed there, and that she'd been too afraid to speak before. She might not be afraid anymore." She paused. "And there was a lawyer in Dalton named Aubrey who helped me when I left. He knew the situation. He wasn't my lawyer exactly, but he told me at the time that if it ever came to a point where I needed a record of what happened, he had some notes." Silas looked at her. "You've been sitting on this. I didn't think I'd need it. You need it now." "I know." He was already standing. "Write them both, tonight. I'll get the letters on the eastbound stage first thing in the morning. It'll take 2 weeks for answers. Then we have 2 weeks to hold on," he said. "We've held on through worse." Those 2 weeks were the longest of her life, and also, in some ways she would not have been able to explain, among the most clarifying. The town's pressure mounted in both directions, the social kind and the practical kind, the snubs and the closed accounts and the way merchants she'd dealt with all winter began finding reasons to be busy when she arrived. She heard, through Dorothy, who had appointed herself an unofficial messenger from whatever portion of the town still had some residual connection to fairness, that Mercer had been holding informal gatherings in the back room of the bank, the kind of gatherings that weren't meetings in any official sense, but which managed to shape opinion the way meetings did. She went about her business in town with her chin level, and her voice pleasant, and her pace unhurried. She bought what she could afford to buy. She greeted the people who would be greeted and did not pursue the ones who wouldn't. She was careful not to give anyone watching her a single thing that could be used. What she could not control was what was happening to Silas. The new ranch hands, sensing instability, were unreliable in ways that added hours to every day's work. One of them, a young man named Greer, who'd seemed promising his first week, didn't show up on a Wednesday, and didn't show up on Thursday, and on Friday sent word through someone at the saloon that he'd found other employment. The remaining 2 worked, but at the compressed, cautious pace of men who were waiting to see which way things fell. Silas absorbed all of this without outward complaint, but she could see it costing him. He came in later each evening. He ate less, not from lack of appetite, but from the compressed focus of a man who is allocating every resource to the primary problem. He slept less, too. She could tell from the lamp that sometimes burned past midnight in the main house window. And Lily felt all of it, even the parts no one explained to her. She came to Elena one evening while Elena was hemming a curtain that had been split by the weight of winter ice pressing through the window frame, and she sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing for a while, which was unusual enough that Elena put down the needle. "Say it," Elena said. "Are we going to have to leave?" Lily's voice was even, but her hands were in her lap the way they got when she was working to keep her face still. Elena looked at her daughter. The honest answer and the comforting answer were not the same answer. "I don't know," she said. "I'm trying to make sure we don't. If we leave..." Lily stopped. "If we leave together," Elena said. "You and me. That doesn't change." "I know that." Lily's jaw was set. "I meant, if we leave, what happens to Silas?" Elena felt the question like a hand on her chest. "He's been here a long time," she said. "He knows how to... Before we came, he was..." Lily searched for the word and came up with it the way children come up with things, directly and without warning. "He was disappearing," she said. "Just slowly. You can disappear slowly, not all at once. He was doing that. He's not doing that anymore." Elena looked at her daughter for a long moment. Outside, the April evening was pulling light out of the sky in the patient way it did, and from the barn she could hear Cord doing last checks, and from somewhere across the yard she could hear Silas's footsteps, that unhurried, specific tread. "We're not going to leave," Elena said. She said it with a certainty she hadn't been sure she had until it came out, and when it did, it felt less like a decision than like a recognition of something that had already been decided, maybe for a while. Lily looked at her and appeared to find this sufficient. She picked up the curtain and looked at the hem. "You missed a section," she said. "I see it." "I can do that part if you want." You don't have to. I know I don't, Lily said, and threaded the needle. 2. Florence Hewitt's letter arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Elena had sent hers. It was 3 pages, densely written in a careful, schooled hand, and it said, among other things, that Florence had been waiting for 3 years for someone to ask her to say what she knew. Aubrey. The lawyer's letter arrived 2 days later. It was shorter, more precise, and it contained a copy of a notarized statement he had made in December of 1882, describing, in his capacity as a legal observer, what Elena Whitmore had told him upon her departure from the Crane household, and what he had independently witnessed regarding Robert Crane's documented behavior toward household employees during a separate legal matter the previous year. Elena read both letters at the kitchen table. Then she sat with her hands flat on the wood and breathed until she could breathe normally. She heard the kitchen door and looked up. Silas was standing there with dirt on his hands from afternoon work, and he looked at her face and stopped. "Good news or bad?" he asked. She slid the letters across the table. He read them standing. He read Florence's letter all the way through, and then Aubrey's, and when he put them down, his face had a different quality. Not relief exactly, because the situation wasn't resolved. The letters were evidence, not resolution, but they were real, and they were specific, and they gave her something she hadn't had. "This is enough to go to Mercer with," he said. "That's not quite how I want to use it," she said. He looked at her. "Mercer sees himself as a man of the community," she said. "Whatever he tells himself in private, publicly, he runs on the idea that he represents something. Stability, respectability, the town's moral order. The letters don't matter to him privately. He probably suspects I have something like this, or would eventually. What matters to him is public opinion. His power is public opinion." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the letters are for the community, not for Mercer's desk." He studied her. "You want to go public with this?" "I think Mercer is counting on the fact that I won't," she said. "I think he's counting on the fact that women in my position don't make things public because public cuts both ways. He's made it ugly for me, and he expects me to want to keep it quiet." "And if he's wrong?" "If he's wrong, I need your help," she said. "I can't do this alone. I'm one woman with 2 letters and a 7-year-old daughter, and a reputation he's spent months destroying. You have something here. This is your community. You've been in it for 11 years. Silas looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and waited and didn't try to fill the silence because the silence was him making a decision, and she respected the weight of it. "I have an idea," he said finally. She waited. "There's a man named Hargrove, Oliver Hargrove. He runs the mill, been in this valley since before Mercer arrived. If Hargrove stands up in a room and says something, people hear it differently than if I stand up alone." He paused. "And there's the Dunbar family. They've got history with Mercer that goes back a few years. A land disagreement that most people in town know about, even if nobody talks about it directly. They might be willing. Will they see it that way? I don't know yet. I have to ask them." He picked up both letters. "Can I take these?" "Yes." He tucked them in his coat. He started for the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame, not looking at her, looking at the yard. "Elena." "Yes." "I said the other night that I had one option that could solve most of this. Kishpamam." He paused. His hand was on the doorframe, and his back was to her, and this was somehow exactly right for the way Silas Boon delivered important things. Not facing you, not performing it, just saying the words plainly and letting them sit. "I meant it. I still mean it. I just want you to know that whatever happens with Hargrove and Dunbar and the letters and Mercer, that's not why I mean it. It's not the solution I'm thinking of. It's the thing I want. And when this is done, one way or the other, I'd like to say it properly." He went out before she could answer. She stood at the table with the letters gone, and the evening light coming through the window, and felt the room around her. Its solidity, its warmth, the shelf she'd built, and the floor she'd scrubbed, and the curtain Lily had helped her hem. And understood, with a clarity that had the quality of something she'd been moving toward for a long time, that she did not want to leave. Not for Lily's sake, though Lily's sake was real, and it mattered. Not because Harlan Creek had become welcoming, because it hadn't, not entirely, not yet, but because this room, this view, this particular combination of people in this place on the map, this had become something. It had become hers, in the way that things become yours, Not because you were given them, but because you poured yourself into them. She wasn't going to let Calvin Mercer take it. She didn't know yet exactly what the fight was going to look like, or how long it would take, or what it would cost all three of them. She knew only that it was coming, that Silas Boon was out there riding toward Oliver Hargrove's mill with 2 letters in his coat pocket, and that whatever he was going to say in the days ahead, she was going to be standing somewhere beside him when he said it. She started making supper. Outside, the sun dropped behind the western ridge, and the long April evening began its slow darkening. And the ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet when it was working. Not empty, just still, carrying everything it carried without needing to announce it. Oliver Hargrove was not a man who gave his word easily, which was exactly why his word meant something when he gave it. Silas had known him for 9 years, long enough to know that Hargrove operated on a personal calculus that was separate from community opinion and largely immune to the kind of pressure Mercer applied through commerce and reputation. He'd built his mill on a creek claim he'd won through 2 years of legal dispute, and he'd run it without borrowing from the Harlan Creek Bank, which was either the result of careful planning or a fortunate instinct, and either way had left him in a position of independence that most men in the valley could not claim. Silas rode to the mill on a Friday morning with the 2 letters in his coat and a presentation of the situation that he'd been composing in his head since the night before. He hadn't slept much. He was aware of that in the particular way you're aware of it, when the tiredness has gone past the stage of being felt and arrived at the stage of being simply present, a condition you move through rather than a sensation you experience. Hargrove listened from his stool beside the mill wheel, arms folded, his broad face giving nothing away while Silas talked. He read both letters when Silas handed them over, slowly, with the unhurried attention of a man who understands that the point of reading carefully is to avoid having to read things twice. When he finished, he folded them and handed them back. "She's telling the truth," he said. It wasn't a question. Silas had noticed that about Hargrove. He stated conclusions rather than asking for confirmation of them, because he trusted his own reading and didn't need the social reassurance of a question. "She is," Silas said, "and Mercer's been building this thing since December. Longer, I think. I think he was watching the land situation before she arrived. She arriving just gave him a better tool." Hargrove looked at the mill stream. The water ran clear and cold from the snowmelt, and the wheel turned at the steady pace it always turned. And there was something about being at the mill that made conversations feel more serious than they did in other places, as though the purposeful machinery around them held people to a higher standard of meaning what they said. "What are you asking me for, Silas?" Hargrove said. "Specifically. I'm asking you to stand up in a room," Silas said. "I don't have the standing alone. You've been here longer than I have, and you don't owe Mercer anything, and people know it. If I go into town and say what I'm going to say, and you're in the room and you're standing, that's different than if I'm standing alone." "Where's this room?" "I was thinking the church. Sunday." Hargrove looked at him sideways. "That's 3 days." "I know." "What makes you think Reverend Aldous will let you use the space for something that's going to become a community argument?" "I'm not going to ask Aldous," Silas said. "I'm going to tell him I need to address the congregation on a community matter. That's within the rights of any member. He can say no and I'll find somewhere else, but he won't say no." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. The wheel turned. Water moved. "Martha won't be happy," he said, which was his way of saying that he was going to do it, because Oliver Hargrove did not cite his wife's opinion as a reason not to do things, only as a condition of doing them. Martha Hargrove was a woman of strong social preferences and a genuine loyalty to anyone she had decided was worth being loyal to, and she and Silas's late wife Nora had been friendly, which Silas suspected was a factor that Hargrove was not going to mention directly. "Tell Martha I'd be obliged," Silas said. "I'll tell her," Hargrove said. "She'll probably come herself." He turned back to the wheel, which was his way of ending a conversation he'd decided was finished. Silas folded the letters back into his coat and rode to the Dunbar property. The Dunbar situation was more complicated because the Dunbars were complicated. A family of 4 brothers who had a collective personality that was best described as stubborn, with occasional outbreaks of generosity, and whose history with Calvin Mercer involved a property line dispute from 4 years back that had been technically resolved but not emotionally resolved, which was the more durable of the 2 resolutions. The oldest Dunbar, Pete, met him at the gate with the expression of a man who is pleased to have company, but wants it understood that this is not weakness. Silas told him the situation. Not everything, just the shape of it, the tax notice, the letters, the credit pressure, the campaign of accumulated damage that had been running since December. Pete Dunbar listened, chewing on a piece of dried grass, squinting into the middle distance in the way of a man whose relationship with decisions is something he takes personally. He's doing to you what he did to us with the fence line, Pete said. Not exactly the same mechanism, Silas said, but the same principle. The principle being that Mercer decides you're inconvenient and then builds a case out of parts until you're sufficiently inconvenient to remove. That's about it. Pete chewed his grass for a while. Then he shouted toward the house, without turning around. Emmett! One of the younger brothers appeared in the doorway. Get the others, Pete said. Silas Boon needs a Sunday. Boy. Elena knew none of the details of what Silas was arranging until Saturday evening, when he came to the cabin after supper and told her. He sat at her table and laid it out. Hargrove, the Dunbars, the church, the plan to stand up in front of the Sunday congregation and say what needed saying. She listened to all of it. Then she said, What exactly are you going to say? The truth, he said. The letters. What Mercer has been doing and why. And he paused and looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. I'm going to say what I said at the door the other night. Properly. In front of whoever's there to hear it. She looked at him for a long time. Her heart was doing something she was trying not to call fear, because it wasn't quite fear. It was closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something very high, where the view is extraordinary and the footing is uncertain, and both of those things are simultaneously true. Silas, you understand that if you do this and it goes badly, I understand. You're standing in this community, your business relationships, your... Elena. His voice was quiet and even and final. I know what I'm risking. I'm asking you if you'll be there. She looked at him. The lamp was between them. It was always the lamp between them, that small circle of light on the table where their most honest conversations happened. Yes, she said, I'll be there. He nodded. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just been told he wouldn't have to carry it the last stretch alone. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them, in the lamplight. It was a ring, small, plain, a band of gold worn smooth on the outside. He didn't say anything. He just set it there and looked at it, and then looked at her. It was my mother's, he said. I'm not doing this right. I know I'm not doing this right, but I've been trying to figure out the right way for 2 months, and I don't think there is a right way. There's just the way. He looked at her steadily. I want you to marry me, not because of Mercer's ordinance, and not because of the tax problem, and not because of any of the practical reasons that make it sensible, though it is sensible. Because because the ranch is more than it was, and I am more than I was. And those two things are the same thing, and they're both because of you. And Lily. He paused. I want Lily to have my name if she'd take it, and I want you to have it too, if you'd want it. It was the longest speech she had ever heard Silas Boon give. It was also, she understood, the most honest speech she had ever heard from any man in her life, which wasn't the same as it being perfect. It was halting in places and matter-of-fact in others, and it didn't have the poetry that proposals were supposed to have, according to the books she'd read as a girl. It had something better than that. It had his actual voice in it. She looked at the ring on the table. Yes, she said. For the second time in 5 minutes, and this one cost her more than the first one, and was worth more than everything she'd given for it. He let out a breath. He looked briefly like a man who has just remembered how to breathe normally after forgetting for a while. Thank you, he said, which was not what people usually said in response to a yes, but which was entirely him. She picked up the ring and put it on herself because he seemed briefly unable to move, and it fit well enough, and she looked at it on her hand in the lamplight and thought, well, here we are. Sunday morning arrived the way mornings arrived in the valley in late April, cold in the first hour, then rapidly relenting as the sun cleared the ridge and the light hit everything with the slightly aggressive cheerfulness of a season that has been postponed too long. Elena dressed in her best, which wasn't saying a great deal. A gray wool dress she'd kept pressed at the bottom of the second bag since December, a dark ribbon, The ring on her left hand that Lily had spotted at breakfast and looked at with the expression of someone receiving information they had suspected for some time. "Is that what I think it is?" Lily asked. "Probably," Elena said. Lily looked at the ring. Then she looked at Silas, who was eating his breakfast with the focused attention of a man trying to behave normally on a day when very little was going to be normal. "Are you going to be my father?" Lily asked him. Silas put down his fork. "I'd like to be," he said. "If that's all right with you." Lily considered this with her full deliberative process, which took approximately 15 seconds, which Elena suspected was shorter than it usually took for things of this size. Then she said, "You can have one of my rocks, the oval gray one with the face. That's the one I give to important things." Silas looked at her very seriously. "I'll take good care of it," he said. Lily nodded, returns to her cornbread, and said, "You should know I already think of you as my father. I've just been waiting for it to be official." Elena looked at the window. She was not going to cry at breakfast. She was absolutely not going to do that. She didn't, but it was a near thing. Dumb. The Harlan Creek Church held perhaps 80 people comfortably, and somewhat more than that when community feeling compelled attendance, which it did on this particular Sunday. Word had moved through the town on Saturday with the particular velocity of news that carries implication, not detailed word because Silas hadn't given anyone the details, but the kind of approximated word that travels through a community on instinct. Something is going to happen. Something that concerns all of us. Be there. They rode in together, the three of them, in the wagon. Silas drove with the deliberate, unhurried pace he always drove with, and Elena sat beside him with Lily between them. And Lily held Copper the kitten in her lap, which no one had planned for but which also no one had suggested against. Elena had seen what the town looked like in the mornings from a distance, from the road coming down out of the hills. She had not ridden into it this directly or this publicly since December, and the difference now was specific. She was arriving not as a woman looking for work or credit or any form of permission, but as someone coming to say something. The difference showed in her posture, and she didn't try to soften it. They tied the wagon and walked to the church. She was aware of people watching from every available surface: porches, windows, the space outside the hardware store where men tended to cluster on Sundays. She did not look away from any of them. She was done looking away. Hargrove was already inside, sitting near the front with Martha, who gave Elena a short, firm nod as she came in. Pete Dunbar was near the back with two of his brothers. Dorothy Gill sat in the middle section with her husband, her face arranged into an expression of determined encouragement. Calvin Mercer was there too. He sat in the third row from the front on the right side, slightly apart from his wife, in the way of a man who has arranged himself to be seen as a member of the congregation rather than a party to what's about to happen. He looked at Silas as they came in, and his face did nothing dramatic. Men like Mercer had faces that were very good at doing nothing dramatic. Reverend Aldous conducted the service as though nothing was unusual, which Elena gave him credit for. He was a thin, colorless man who seemed to have organized his entire existence around the avoidance of conflict, but he was not actively unkind, and he had told Silas on Saturday that he would allow 5 minutes at the close of the service for community address. He allowed it. The service ended. He introduced Silas by name and sat down with the expression of a man entrusting a lit match to someone and hoping they knew what they were doing. Silas stood up. He went to the front of the room and turned around and looked at it, not performing it, not building dramatic effect, just looking at the actual faces of the people who were actually there, which took maybe 10 seconds of silence that felt considerably longer. Then he spoke. He wasn't a practiced speaker. He didn't have the politician's rolling cadence or the preacher's building rhythm. He spoke the way he did everything, with economy and precision, choosing words the same way he chose every tool, for fitness rather than impressiveness. He said he had something to tell them about a woman named Elena Whitmore. He said she had arrived in this town in December with her daughter and been turned away from a boarding house in the snow, and that he had offered her work and shelter on the ranch because it was December, and because he needed the help, and because he had seen enough of the world to know the difference between a person running from trouble they'd made and a person running from trouble that had been made for them. He said she had worked the Boon homestead with a diligence and competence that had changed what the ranch was capable of, and that the winter had shown him more about her character than most people showed him in years. He said that certain claims had been circulating about her past, and that he had in his possession documentation that directly refuted those claims. A witness statement from a woman named Florence Hewitt, who had personally observed the events in question, and a legal declaration from a lawyer named Aubrey, who had documented the original situation at the time of its occurrence. He produced both letters and held them up. He said he was willing to let any person in the room read both documents and verify for themselves that what he was saying was factual. The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest, the quality of quiet that happens when a large number of people are working through information all at once. Then he said the thing that changed the quality of the room entirely. He said that Elena Whitmore had agreed to be his wife. He said he was telling them this not as an announcement requiring their approval, but because they were his community, the people he'd lived beside and done business with and relied upon for 11 years, and he believed that when a man had something important to tell, he should tell it to the people who mattered to him directly. He said he was aware that some of them had questions about the nature of the household at the Boon Ranch, and that those questions were now answered. Then he said the thing that Elena had not expected him to say, and which she would remember exactly for the rest of her life. He said, "I know what this woman is. She fed my ranch through a winter that would have broken most people. She kept my house running when I'd let it fall into a kind of ruin I didn't like to admit. She pulled my daughter." He stopped, corrected himself without apology. "She pulled Lily out of a frozen creek in February and would have gone in herself to do it. She has more capacity for decent behavior under indecent circumstances than anyone I have ever stood beside. If any of you have decided to judge her on the basis of what Calvin Mercer has been spreading through this town for the past 4 months, then I am asking you, as plainly as I know how to ask anything, to reconsider, because he has been lying, and I have the proof of it in my hand." He stopped talking. The room absorbed this. Elena, sitting in the second row with Lily pressed against her side and Copper apparently asleep in Lily's lap, did not look at Mercer. She looked at Silas, who was still standing at the front of the room with the letters in his hand, looking back at her with the steady directness that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him on a December street and which had not diminished in all the months since. For a long moment, the room was just the room, people and benches and light coming through the windows and the sound of someone's child shifting in a pew. Then Oliver Hargrove stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood up slowly in the deliberate way he did everything and looked at the room. Martha Hargrove stood up beside him. There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds, and then one of the Dunbar brothers, Emmett, the second youngest, stood up, and Pete Dunbar after him, and the third one a moment later. Dorothy Gill's husband stood up. He was a quiet man whose opinion had never been dramatically expressed in any public forum in Harlan Creek, and he stood up with the slightly surprised air of a man discovering that he had a position on something. Dorothy stood up beside him. There were others. Not all of them. Not anything close to all of them. There were people in that room who stayed seated, some from conviction and some from habit, and some from the particular fear of Mercer's influence that was real and that Elena understood and did not entirely blame them for. It was not a unanimous room, but it was enough. It was enough people standing that the quality of the room had changed, that what Mercer had built over 4 months of careful systematic work had cracked down the middle in a Sunday morning. Mercer himself sat in the third row and did not move. His face was composed. He had the face of a man who has just recalculated and is already thinking about the next move, which was useful information. It meant he wasn't finished, that whatever had happened in this room wasn't the end of the problem. But his expression also had something in it she hadn't seen before on that careful, controlled face, a very slight and very controlled uncertainty, the kind that lives behind the composure of people who have just discovered that their model of a situation was wrong in ways they hadn't accounted for. Lily, who had been watching all of this with Copper curled in her lap, and her eyes moving from face to face with the alert, recording attention of a child who is going to remember this particular day for a very long time, leaned toward Elena and said quietly, "Are we winning?" Elena looked at the room, at Hargrove and Martha still standing, at Pete Dunbar and his brothers, at Dorothy and her husband, at Silas, who was still at the front of the room and who had just turned to look at the standing people with an expression that was not quite surprised and not quite grateful, but something that partook of both without settling comfortably in either. "We're not losing," she said. Lily appeared to find this an adequate assessment. She stroked Copper's ear and watched Mercer, who she had described as doing arithmetic about people, and she watched him with the frank, clear-eyed attention of someone who has identified a threat and intends to keep track of it. The aftermath of the Sunday meeting was not a resolution. Anyone who expected it to be was misreading how these things worked. What it was a shift. In the days that followed, some things changed and some things didn't. Pollard's Supplies sent a supply order up to the ranch filled and with the customary credit terms, which Silas received without comment. Greer, the ranch hand who'd left, didn't come back, and that was fine. They had enough hands now, and the ones they had were steady. The two new men who'd been working in compressed uncertainty relaxed perceptibly, as though a barometric pressure had changed, and their work improved accordingly. Dorothy Gill stopped by the cabin on Monday, without a pie this time, and sat at Elena's table and said, "I should have done more in December." "You came when you had something to say," Elena told her. "I should have had something to say sooner." Elena looked at her. Dorothy was a woman who would carry this guilt for longer than it deserved, and who would probably express it through showing up in ways that were more concrete and more useful than guilt. That was a workable arrangement. "The Hewitt woman," Dorothy said. "The one in the letters. She's brave." "She is," Elena said. "She's 300 miles away. And she's brave." Dorothy said it with a specificity that suggested she was applying the comparison somewhere nearer than 300 miles. "Sometimes distance helps," Elena said, which was diplomatic and which also happened to be true. "And sometimes you just have to stand up where you are." Dorothy nodded, a small nod with a large amount of something behind it. Mercer was quiet. This was not the same as defeated, and Elena knew it well enough not to confuse the two. He was quiet the way water is quiet when it finds a new course, rerouting rather than stopping. She heard through the network of information that Dorothy had apparently committed herself to maintaining that Mercer had been in correspondence with the county seat, that there had been a conversation about the tax situation, that he was patient. She brought this to Silas on Wednesday evening. He listened and said, "The cattle sale is in 6 weeks. I know the numbers. If the sale goes as it should, we clear the tax debt and have operating margin through the fall. And if Mercer interferes with the buyer?" I contacted the buyer directly last week, sent him a letter explaining the situation and informing him that any third-party communication he received about the Boon Ranch should be referred back to me before any decision was made. He paused. "The buyer is a man named Carver. I've sold to him for 4 years. He knows my cattle. He wrote back and said he'd be here in June, same as always." She looked at him. "You did that last week." "I did." "You didn't tell me." "I was handling it." She considered being irritated by this, and then didn't, because the irritation didn't have anywhere useful to go, and also because she understood him. Silas Boon's instinct when a problem needed handling was to handle it first and discuss it when it was handled, which was frustrating, and also, she was learning to admit, usually effective. "Going forward," she said. "You tell me." He looked at her. "Fair enough." "I'm not a person you keep the ledger from, Silas." "I know you're not. Old habit." "Break it," she said. "Working on it," he said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way it moved. She shook her head and went back to the stove. What she didn't say, what she held carefully, the way you hold something fragile in unfamiliar hands, was that the Sunday morning was still with her. Not the public of it, not the standing people, but the moment before, the moment when Silas had been at the front of the room finding his words, and the word he'd used for Lily, "my daughter." He'd caught himself mid-sentence and corrected it, as though using the word before they'd formally agreed to it was something he had to account for. But the word had come first. It had come before the correction. That was the word his instinct had reached for. She thought about that, in the evenings, when the ranch was quiet and Lily was asleep, and she could sit with things long enough to understand what she felt about them. She felt something she was going to have to find a name for. She didn't have one yet that seemed large enough. But Oliver Hargrove came by the ranch on a Friday afternoon, alone, and found Elena repairing the fence on the south pasture. He reined in and looked at the work and said, "That's the third rail." "The whole line needs doing," she said, not stopping. "I'm working east to west." He watched her for a moment. "Martha wants you to come to supper Sunday. Both of you. All 3 of you." She looked up at him. Hargrove's face was not a face that did things theatrically, which made its expressions more reliable. This one was simple. He was extending something, and he was not going to repeat the extension. "We'd be glad to," she said. He nodded once, turned his horse, and rode back toward the road. Elena turned back to the fence and drove the next nail with 3 strikes, clean and level, and let herself feel, not the relief of the Sunday morning, which was complicated, and not the worry about Mercer's next move, which was persistent, but something simpler and more immediate, the particular satisfaction of a nail driven true, a rail that would hold, a line of fence that was being made right one section at a time, all the way from one end of the pasture to the other. She worked until the light went. Mercer made his last move on a Tuesday. Elena knew it was coming. She'd known it the way you know weather is coming when the light changes quality before the clouds arrive. Something in the air, something in the particular silence from town over the 2 weeks following the Sunday meeting, a silence that was too organized to be acceptance. Mercer was not a man who accepted things. He was a man who rerouted, and she'd been watching for where the water was going to come out. It came out at the county seat. A writer arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with an official document, not from the bank this time, but from the county clerk's office in Millhaven, 40 miles east. The document referenced the outstanding tax lien on the Boon property and formally notified Silas Boon that a complaint had been filed questioning the legal validity of the original land claim on the basis of an alleged discrepancy in the original survey documents from 1871. Silas read it at the kitchen table. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and put his hands flat on either side of it and looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes. "He found the survey," Silas said. Elena came around the table to read it over his shoulder. "What survey discrepancy?" "There's a corner marker on the northwest boundary. It was set by the original surveyor, and there's always been a question about whether it was set correctly, whether the line runs 8 degrees east or 12. I had it looked at 4 years ago, and the man I hired said it was within acceptable variance. I filed his report with the county and thought it was done." He paused. "I should have pushed harder on it." Mercer found a surveyor willing to say otherwise. "That's what I'd guess." She looked at the document. The language was careful, precisely the kind of language that was designed to create the maximum amount of uncertainty with the minimum amount of provable falsity. It didn't say the land claim was invalid. It said a complaint had been filed raising questions that would require a formal review process. A review process that would take time. Time during which a contested claim would make the tax payment complicated. Complicated enough to push the deadline past June, past the cattle sale, past the margin. It was a good move. She had to admit, in the cold, dispassionate part of her that assessed these things, that it was a very good move. Mercer had spent the Sunday morning calculating, and he had found the one remaining lever. Silas was looking at the wall. "Silas," she said. "I'm thinking." She let him think. She put the coffee on because it was something to do with her hands and because he was going to need it, and because she was also thinking, running the situation through every angle she had, and the angles kept arriving at the same place. "The original surveyor," she said, "from 1871. Is he still living?" "Died in 78. "Records? County seat has them. That's the whole problem. The records from 71 are incomplete. The original notes had water damage, which is why the question existed in the first place. And the man you hired 4 years ago, his report is filed?" "At the county clerk." "Yes. So there are 2 things in the record. His report saying variance acceptable, and now Mercer's surveyor saying otherwise." "That's right." She sat down across from him. "Then it's a dispute between 2 expert opinions, and a dispute between 2 expert opinions needs a third. A tiebreaker." She looked at him. "Is there a state survey office?" Silas went still. "The territorial survey office. In the capital. They have the authority to conduct official boundary determinations. I've never had to use them, but I know they exist." "Would their determination supersede Mercer's complaint?" He looked at her with the specific expression she'd seen only a few times, the one that meant he was rearranging what he knew around a new piece of information. "Yes," he said slowly. "A territorial determination would close the complaint. You'd need to petition them, and there'd be a fee, and it takes time." "How much time?" 6 to 8 weeks if you file it urgent. faster if you can get a territorial official to endorse the petition. Is there a territorial official you know? He sat back. I know of one. His name is Garrett. He comes through the valley twice a year for the land registry review. I've dealt with him twice, briefly. He's not a man I'd call a friend, but I've never given him reason to dislike me. When does he next come through? I'd have to find out. She put her hands on the table. Then we find out today. And we file the petition today. And we get the fee together and get the paperwork to the Capitol by the end of the week.
He looked at her steadily. The fee is $40. She didn't hesitate. I have 23 from wages. Something crossed his face. Not embarrassment because he was past the stage of being embarrassed by her directness, but something adjacent to it, the last remnant of a man who had always handled the financial problems of the ranch alone and hadn't yet fully adjusted to not handling them alone. I have the rest, he said. Then we have $40, she said. Between us. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd stopped trying to name months ago, because the name for it was something that kept expanding every time she thought she'd found its edges. Between us, he said. They rode to Millhaven together, the three of them. Lily came because there was no arrangement to leave her, and because Lily, when informed that they were riding to the county seat to deal with a legal problem, expressed the opinion that she would like to see what a county seat looked like, and neither Silas nor Elena felt they had a strong enough argument against this. Cord watched the ranch. It was a 4-hour ride. They took it at a pace the horses could maintain, and Lily spent the first 2 hours asking questions about the territorial survey system that neither Silas nor Elena had comprehensive answers to, and the next hour explaining her theories about why bureaucracies moved slowly, which were surprisingly astute for someone who had recently turned 8, and the last hour falling asleep against Elena's arm with her hat tipped forward on her face. Silas glanced at her. She argued herself to sleep. She usually does, Elena said. He looked at the road. The spring had progressed enough that the country between Harlan Creek and Millhaven was opening up, green coming through the brown in patches, the willows along the creek bottoms running lime yellow. It was good country. She'd come to understand that. The particular quality of this valley, its particular combination of grass and water and mountain and sky. She understood why Silas had stopped here. She understood it in her body now, not just in her head. Are you scared? She asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave questions that deserved it. No, he said. Not anymore. I was scared in December. I've been scared before and since, but right now I'm not. Why not? He glanced at her sideways. Because right now I know what I'm fighting for. That's different from just fighting. She looked at the road ahead of them. Yes, she said. It is, Geet. The Territorial Land Office in Millhaven occupied a 2-story stone building that smelled of old paper and the specific mustiness of official processes stretching back decades. They left Lily on a bench in the outer hall with strict instructions and a piece of hard candy and went in to file the petition. The clerk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and an expression of deeply ingrained procedural caution. He looked at their petition. He looked at the attached documents. He looked at the $40. Urgent processing, he said. You understand that urgent means 8 weeks, not 2. We understand, Silas said. We need the petition logged and dated today. The date matters. The clerk looked at him. Why does the date matter? Because a complaint was filed against this claim on Tuesday. If our petition for territorial determination is filed before the complaint review begins, the review process is suspended pending territorial determination. That's in the statutes. The clerk looked at Silas, then at Elena, then back at Silas. You've researched this. We have. The clerk looked at the petition again. He looked at it for a long time, and Elena had the distinct impression that he was checking to find a reason to refuse and not finding one. I'll need to have Mr. Connell verify the suspension provision before I log it under urgent, he said. Who's Mr. Connell? Elena asked. Deputy Territorial Registrar. Is he here today? He's in the building. Then we'll wait, she said. They waited for 45 minutes on a wooden bench in a hallway that smelled of old paper, with Lily eating her candy and drawing faces on her boot with her fingernail. Then Mr. Connell, who was a heavy-set man of 60, with the wary eyes of someone who had spent a career finding problems in documents, came out and read the petition and looked at the statutes and looked at the petition again.
The suspension provision applies, he said, if the complaint review has not formally commenced. He looked at Silas. Has it commenced? The document I received Tuesday cited a 30-day preliminary review period before formal commencement. Connell did the calculation. Then you're inside it. He looked at the petition once more, and then looked at Elena in the way official men sometimes looked at women in official settings, which was the look of someone trying to categorize and failing. This your land? My husband's land, she said. It was the first time she'd used that word in an official context, and it came out steadily, with none of the self-consciousness she'd half expected. We're filing jointly. Connell looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with the complete equanimity of a man who has already decided how this is going to go and is waiting for the other person to catch up. Connell stamped the petition. The date of filing was today. 8 weeks, he said. 6 if we can get a surveyor freed up in the territory. You'll receive written notification of the assigned surveyor and date. Thank you, Silas said. They walked back out into the afternoon light. Lily, who had apparently been listening to the entire exchange through the door, which they should have anticipated, looked up from her boots. Did we win? She asked. We bought ourselves time, Elena said. Is that the same as winning? It's the first part of it, Silas said. Lily stood up and put her hat on properly. Good. I'm hungry. Can we eat before we ride back? The 6 weeks between filing the petition and the territorial surveyor's arrival were not easy, but they were workable. And workable was something Elena had learned to receive with gratitude. Mercer was quiet in the specific way of a man who has filed a legal complaint and is now obligated to wait for the process to proceed, which meant his direct interference was constrained. He couldn't pull the credit, not without the complaint being resolved first. And Silas's lawyer in Millhaven, a man named Price, who charged more than was comfortable and was worth every cent of it, had sent a letter to the county clerk clarifying that any bank action on the credit line during an active territorial dispute would constitute interference in a legal process and would be documented accordingly. Mercer was boxed in. Not defeated, boxed in. Elena knew the difference and held it carefully because overconfidence was the particular failure of people who had just survived something and mistaken survival for resolution. The ranch, meanwhile, did what ranches do in May and early June. It demanded everything from everyone without apology. The calving had ended, but the branding began, and the branding required all available hands working in coordination through days that started before the light and ended after it. Elena worked alongside them, not the roping and branding itself, which required skills she didn't have, but everything around it, the keeping of records, the management of the gate work, the hauling of water, and the maintenance of the field lunch that kept the men functional through the long afternoon hours. She'd never done ranch branding before December. By June, she could look at a calf's ear notch and tell you which pasture it had come from. Lily helped where she could be helped and stayed clear where she couldn't, which required a level of self-management that 8-year-olds are not always capable of. But Lily had developed her own working relationship with the ranch, a kind of earned familiarity that let her understand intuitively which situations wanted her presence and which didn't. She spent the branding days doing what she'd decided was her job, keeping track of the count, which Silas had given her as a real task rather than a make-work one, walking the marked calves to the near pasture and making sure the tally matched the records. At the end of the 3rd day of branding, Silas sat down on the fence rail beside Lily and looked at her tally sheet. You're off by 1, he said. Lily looked at the sheet. No, I'm not. Look again. She looked again. No, she said. You're off by 1. I counted the roan in the second group twice. Silas looked at his count. Then he looked at hers. Huh, he said. I know, Lily said, with a restraint that Elena, watching from the gate, found heroic. Silas looked at her sideways. You're going to be insufferable. Probably, Lily agreed. He took her tally sheet and folded it into his shirt pocket, and they sat on the fence rail together in the late afternoon light, and Elena watched them from the gate and thought about what it meant to build a thing. Not to find it, not to be given it, but to build it, rail by rail and day by day, out of work and proximity and the accumulated weight of small, honest moments. She had a name for what she felt, finally. It had taken her until June to find it, which was longer than she would have liked, but she'd needed to be sure it was the right word and not a smaller word dressed up. The word was home. Meet. The territorial surveyor arrived on a Thursday in the second week of June, a lean, weathered man named Soames, who came with 2 assistants and a set of equipment that Lily examined with an interest that Soames apparently found endearing, because he explained each piece to her in more detail than was professionally required while his assistants set up the transit on the northwest boundary. The survey took 2 full days. Soames and his team walked every boundary line, took measurements at every corner marker, cross-referenced against the original 1871 survey notes, against Silas's 1882 expert report, and against their own instruments. Elena and Silas waited. They did not wait well. This was something she learned about them both in those 2 days, that they were people who functioned better when there was something to do, and waiting without doing was its own particular kind of hard. She scrubbed things that didn't need scrubbing. He repaired fence line that had another month's life in it. Lily made conversation with Soames's assistants until one of them taught her how to read a transit in self-defense. On the afternoon of the second day, Soames came to the main house and asked to sit down. He sat at the kitchen table, the table Elena had repaired in December, the leg she'd fixed on the first night, the table that had been the site of most of the honest conversations of the past 6 months, and he opened his field notebook and put his pen down beside it. The northwest corner marker is correct, he said. The original surveyor set it at 10 degrees northeast, which is within the acceptable variance established by territorial statute for surveys conducted prior to 1875. The complaint filed in Millhaven cited a margin error that exists in the notes but does not represent an actual boundary error. The complaint is without basis. Silas looked at the table for a moment. Elena looked at Soames. "That's your official finding?" she said. "It will be in the report I file with the Territorial Land Office within the week. Once it's filed, the complaint is administratively closed and the land claim is confirmed." He looked between them. "I've seen this type of complaint before. The specific argument made, citing the notation variance without acknowledging the statutory provision, is something a person would have to know to look for. It's not a common strategy." "No," Silas said. "I don't imagine it is." Soames looked at him with the direct gaze of a man who knows more than he is saying and has decided that what he knows belongs in his report and not in this conversation. "Your claim is sound," he said. "It always was." He closed his notebook. He accepted a cup of coffee because Elena put it in front of him, and it would have been rude to refuse, and he drank it and talked to Lily about the transit for 20 minutes while his assistants packed up outside, and then he left. Silas and Elena sat at the table after he'd gone. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the June afternoon was doing what June afternoons did in this valley, filling up with light and warmth and the particular quality of a season that had earned itself, that had come through something to get here. "It's over," Silas said. "The complaint is over," Elena said carefully. "Mercer isn't. No, but he's out of moves. The land's confirmed, the credit line's intact, and Carver comes next week for the cattle." He looked at his hands. "We're going to make the tax payment." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. They were not people who celebrated loudly or easily, and they both knew that the road behind them had cost things that couldn't be fully recovered. The winter's uncertainty, the months of accumulated pressure, the toll of being people that a community had tried to grind down. Those things were real, and they left marks, but they were on the other side. "Silas," she said. "Yes." "Let's get married before the cattle sale." He looked at her. "The sale is in 6 days." "I know." "That's not much time to—" "I know," she said again. "I don't need much time. I've been ready for a while." He looked at her steadily, and the thing that moved across his face was not what it used to be in December or January or even April, not the careful, controlled expression of a man who had learned to keep the inside of himself separate from the outside. It was more open than that. It was the face of a man who had been shown, against his own expectation, that the inside and the outside could be the same thing, and who was still getting used to it. "All right," he said, "before the sale. Let's They married on a Saturday morning, the 14th of June, under the cottonwood trees at the edge of the south pasture, where the ground rose slightly toward the first bench, and the view opened up to the full length of the valley. Elena had not wanted the church. She'd thought about it and decided that the church belonged to the community in a way that felt complicated still, and that what she wanted was something that belonged to the ranch, to the particular piece of ground they'd all three spent a winter and a spring building a life on. Silas had not argued. The ceremony was conducted by Justice of the Peace Aldred from Millhaven, a small, precise man who did this work without ceremony, but with a genuine attention that was its own kind of gravity. The witnesses were Oliver and Martha Hargrove, and Cord, and Pete Dunbar, who came alone because he said his brothers would eat everything at the reception, and he decided to make a sacrifice on behalf of the food supply. Dorothy Gill came too, with her husband and their daughter, the daughter who was Lily's age and whose name was Bess, and who had, in the week since the Sunday meeting, begun appearing at the ranch with the tentative persistence of a child who wants to be friends and isn't sure yet if the invitation is open. It was open. Lily had made that clear with the directness she brought to most things. It was not a large wedding. It was not a beautiful wedding in the way that people sometimes arrange beauty for these occasions, with flowers brought in and ribbons and the kind of production that costs money they didn't have and wouldn't have spent that way regardless. What it had was the cottonwood trees in their full June leaf, and the grass on the south pasture long and moving in the warm morning wind, and the particular clarity of the mountain air after a season of weather, and the view of the valley that Silas had stood at a claim office and chosen 11 years ago because it did something to him that no other place had done. Elena wore the gray wool dress, pressed again, and a piece of ribbon she'd bought at Hatch's store when she'd gone in on Thursday, at a counter where Hatch had greeted her with something that wasn't quite warmth yet, but was the preliminary motion toward it. She wore the ring that had been his mother's. She wore her hair the way she wore it every day, because she didn't have another way, and because she was, at this point in her life, done pretending to be a version of herself that required extra arrangements. Silas wore his good shirt, which was the one she'd mended twice, and which fit him correctly in the shoulders, and which he'd pressed himself badly that morning. She'd found the iron out and slightly scorched and said nothing. Lily stood between them, which was her own decision and which nobody had suggested and nobody had opposed. She was wearing her second dress, which was the blue one that had been in the bag since December, and which still fit because Lily was growing slowly and sideways rather than up, a fact she found frustrating and which everyone else found quietly endearing. She was holding the oval gray rock from her collection, the one with the face, the important one she'd given Silas on the morning they'd talked about fathers. She'd asked for it back for the ceremony. He'd given it back without question. She held it in both hands the way people hold things they need to feel the weight of. Aldred said the words. They were the words he always said, not custom-made or personalized, but delivered with enough genuine attention that they didn't feel rote. Silas said I do in the same voice he said everything, level, certain, without performance. Elena said I do in a voice that was also level and also certain, and which cost her something to keep that way. Not from doubt, but from the particular emotional weight of having spent years not being certain of anything and finding herself, on a Saturday morning under cottonwood trees, absolutely certain of this. Aldred asked if there was anything either of them wished to add. Silas said yes. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a folded paper and unfolded it, and Elena saw that it was a legal document, a form she didn't immediately recognize. He held it out to Lily. "This is for you," he said. "I filed it in Millhaven on Thursday. It's called a declaration of paternity. It means you're my father," Lily said. She was looking at the paper. Her voice had gone very quiet, which was the Lily version of the emotion that other people expressed other ways. "Officially," he said. "Lily Boon, if you want it." Lily looked at the paper. She looked at it for a long time, long enough that Bess Gill, standing slightly behind her, reached out and took her hand without saying anything, which was either instinct or exceptional 8-year-old perceptiveness, and Elena chose to think it was both. "I want it," Lily said. She took the paper with both hands, the rock still in one fist, and held both things at once, which seemed to her to be the right way to do it. The old important thing and the new important thing, together. Martha Hargrove made a small sound that she immediately suppressed. Cord looked at a point on the horizon with extreme concentration. Elena put her arm around Lily and felt her daughter lean in, and looked at Silas, and Silas looked back at her, and whatever the look contained, it was between the two of them, and didn't need witnesses, though it had them. Carver arrived the following Friday with his buyers and his offer, which was fair, not generous because Carver was a businessman and fair was what he did, not generous, but fair was enough.
The cattle sold well. The tax payment was made the following Monday, with enough margin remaining that Silas paid Cord a bonus that Cord received by grunting once and putting it in his pocket without further comment, which was Cord's version of a speech.
The summer built itself in the way of summers that come after hard winters, with a kind of excess, as though the season understood it owed something and was paying it back with interest. The grass on the south pasture grew better than Silas had seen it in 3 years. The creek ran clear and cold, and Lily was not allowed near it unaccompanied, a rule she observed imperfectly, but with better judgment than she'd had in February. New ranch hands came in July. 2 men recommended by Pete Dunbar, steady workers with no connection to Mercer's network, which had contracted considerably since the Sunday meeting and contracted further after Soames's report became public record. Mercer himself remained in Harlan Creek, running his bank, conducting his business. He did not approach the Boon Ranch. He did not approach Elena in town. He had the look, on the occasion she saw him, of a man who has lost a battle he'd expected to win and is reassigning his energies elsewhere, which was as much resolution as life in a small frontier community typically offered, and which she accepted as sufficient. The community itself did not transform overnight. She would have been suspicious of it if it had. What it did was shift, the way ground shifts in a thaw, slowly, under the surface first, the change not visible until it has already happened. People who had turned away in April began making eye contact in June. Merchants who had refused credit extended it again without ceremony. The women who had been silent at the church began stopping by the dry goods store at the same time Elena did, which was coincidence the first time, and not coincidence the second. Dorothy Gill organized what she called a neighborhood supper in July at her house, which was the frontier equivalent of a reconciliation dinner, not acknowledged as such, because frontier people did not typically acknowledge things that could be demonstrated instead, but everyone present understood what it was. Elena went. She brought a pie, because bringing a pie to these things was the social vocabulary that operated at this latitude, and she was fluent in it now. She sat at Dorothy's table and talked to women she'd been invisible to in December, and she was honest without being sharp and warm without performing it, and she understood in the course of the evening that being accepted by a community is not the same as belonging to it, and that belonging is the longer and more valuable project. That you build it from exactly these moments, from suppers and small exchanges and the accumulated weight of being present and real and imperfect and still there. She was still there. On a Sunday evening in late August, when the light in the valley had turned the particular gold of late summer and the cottonwoods were just beginning to show the first suggestion of yellow at their edges, Elena walked up the slope behind the house to the graves. She hadn't been back since December. She'd walked past them twice in spring but hadn't stopped. This time she stopped. She stood in front of Nora Boon's marker and the small one beside it for a while. The ground around them was clean. She noticed that, the way the grass there was trimmed back, which meant Silas came here and she'd never seen him do it, which was the kind of thing he would do in the quiet early mornings before anyone else was moving. She thought about what to say and then thought that she didn't need to say anything, that this was not a conversation so much as a recognition. Here were the people who had come before her. Here was the shape of what had been lost. She stood in the presence of it without trying to make it into something else. She was not Nora. She would not try to be Nora. But she was living in the house Nora had wanted built, cooking at the stove Nora had used, sleeping under a roof that Silas had made with 2 hired men and his own hands in the second year of a marriage that had ended badly and too soon. She was raising a daughter on land that Nora had walked on, beside a man who had learned from grief the precise value of the things he'd been given and had not been careful enough with. She understood all of this without resentment and without discomfort, because she was, at 31, past the age of expecting the ground she stood on to be uncomplicated. She heard boots on the slope behind her. She didn't turn around. Silas came and stood beside her. He looked at the markers for a moment. "I come up some mornings," he said. "I know, the grass." He nodded. "Eat." They stood there together for a while. The valley lay below them, the ranch in the evening light, the south pasture with the cattle moving slowly across the grass, the creek catching the low sun on its surface, the main house with smoke already rising from the kitchen because Lily was in there doing the thing she'd taken on as an afternoon project, which was teaching herself to make biscuits without supervision, and which had produced 3 excellent biscuits and 1 incident that had required a thorough cleaning of the stove. "I want to tell you something," Silas said. "All right. I spent 4 years thinking that what happened here," he indicated the graves, briefly, without drama, "that what happened was the end of the story. My story. I thought the rest of it was just time, working the land, keeping it going, without a reason beyond the keeping." She waited. "I was wrong about that," he said. "I know that now. Not because things worked out." He stopped. "Things don't just work out. You work them out. You came here with nothing, and you fixed what was broken, and you held it together when I didn't know what I was holding, and you found the people who would stand up in a room, and you filed the petition, and you drove the nails into the fence." He paused. "And you let Lily love this place and let me—" Another pause. "Let me be someone worth coming home to." Elena looked at the valley. She didn't trust her voice immediately, so she waited until she did. "You already were someone worth coming home to," she said. "You just needed someone to come home to you so you'd know it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably true." "I know it is." He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved. "Biscuits are going to burn," he said. "I know. Lily overestimates the heat." She didn't move immediately. Neither did he. They stood for another moment on the slope in the last of the evening light, and the valley held everything it held without trying to explain itself, and the graves were behind them, and the house was below them, and somewhere in between was everything they had made. Then she turned and walked down the slope, and he walked beside her, and the smoke from the kitchen was a friendly kind of smoke, the kind that means someone is trying, and the door was unlocked the way it always was now, the way it should always have been. Not because there was nothing to be afraid of in the world, because there always had been, and always would be, but because this particular door, on this particular piece of ground, at the end of this particular day, didn't need to be anything other than what it was. Open. There is something that people who have lived through difficult things understand that people who haven't often miss, and it is this. Survival is not the same as living, and the distance between them is not covered by luck or time, but by the daily and mostly unglamorous choice to keep building. Elena Whitmore came to Harlan Creek with 2 bags and a daughter and nothing else that anyone could see, and what she found there was not a welcoming community or a ready-made life or the uncomplicated new beginning that the stories tell you waits somewhere on the other side of your hardest chapter. What she found was a broken-down ranch and a broken-down man and a community with all the flaws that communities have when they are afraid, which is to say all the flaws that people have when they are afraid, which is all the flaws there are. She did not fix any of it by being remarkable. She fixed it by being present and persistent and honest, and by understanding, which is the hardest understanding and the one that takes the longest to arrive, that the life you need is not somewhere waiting for you to find it. It is something you make from the materials available, with the people willing to stand beside you, in the place where you finally put down the bags. Silas Boon had believed his life was over. He had been wrong, and being wrong about that was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he knew it. He had learned, at 43, which is a respectable age to learn something, that grief does not end but it changes shape, as a small girl had told him once in a barn, and that the shape it changes into can be something you live alongside rather than inside. Lily Boon, and she was Lily Boon now, officially and in every way that mattered, grew up on that ranch understanding something about identity that most children take years longer to understand, that a name is not given to you by the people who made you. It is given to you by the people who choose you. Choice is the more durable of the two. The valley changed around them, slowly, in the way that valleys change, the years adding themselves to the landscape in rings, the way trees do, each one visible only in what it left behind. The Boone Ranch grew. Not extravagantly, because this was the frontier and extravagance was a different climate, but solidly, the way things grow when they are tended by people who understand that what they are tending matters. Mercer remained in Harlan Creek for 3 more years, and then sold the bank and moved to the capital city, where the returns were larger and the complications, presumably, more to his taste. Nobody in Harlan Creek said much about his leaving. These things resolved themselves eventually, not through justice exactly. Justice was too clean a word for the imprecise way the world settled accounts, but through the simple arithmetic of time and reputation, which in small communities amounts to the same thing in the long run. What endured was simpler and more durable than any of them, in those first hard months, had allowed themselves to imagine. A kitchen table with a repaired leg, and 3 people around it, and a cat named Copper of indeterminate age, and the particular quality of lamplight on a winter evening when the snow is doing what snow does and the stove is doing what stoves do, and outside is outside and inside is inside, and the line between them is clear and warm and holds. That is what they built. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.